In February 1943, American forces in Tunisia faced seasoned German and Italian units hardened by years of desert combat. The United States had landed in North Africa only months earlier during Operation Torch. Many American divisions were newly blooded, their officers adjusting to coalition command structures and unfamiliar terrain. The map of central Tunisia showed a series of mountain passes cutting through the Atlas Range. Kasserine Pass became the fracture point. German forces under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel and General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim assembled armored and mechanized units totaling tens of thousands of men, supported by tanks weighing over 20 tons and artillery batteries capable of firing shells exceeding 20 pounds each. American units deployed across a wide front, with positions often separated by miles. Coordination lagged, communications faltered across rugged terrain. At the operational level, the German objective was to push west through the passes, disrupt Allied logistics, and seize supply depots stocked with fuel and ammunition, measured in hundreds of tons. American supply dumps in the region contained gasoline reserves in the tens of thousands of gallons, and artillery shells stacked in open-air depots vulnerable to capture or destruction. Inside an American M4 Sherman tank idling near the pass, the crew felt the engine's steady vibration under a metal hull roughly 2 inches thick at the front. The 75mm gun fired shells weighing around 15 pounds. Yet tactical deployment fractured cohesion. Tanks were often dispersed in small groups rather than concentrated. When German panzer units advanced in coordinated thrusts, American positions collided with concentrated armor and artillery fire. The fighting intensified between February 19th and February 22nd. German units breached forward American lines, exploiting gaps between inexperienced formations. In some sectors, casualty rates climbed above 20% within days. Units withdrew in disorder. Equipment was abandoned. Trucks weighing several tons, artillery pieces over 2,000 pounds, ammunition crates left in haste. When I once examined after-action reports written by American regimental commanders alongside German operational summaries, I noticed how frequently American officers cited confusion over command hierarchy and delayed orders. Coalition coordination between American and British forces required recalibration under fire. German units, though outnumbered overall in Tunisia, achieved local superiority through concentration. Artillery fire fractured defensive positions in narrow valleys. German anti-tank guns knocked out American vehicles at ranges measured in hundreds of yards. Infantry advancing through rocky slopes felt concussion from shells reverberate through stone. Dust and smoke reduced visibility. Retreat routes clogged with vehicles attempting to reposition. Yet the defeat did not extend unchecked. Allied reserves moved to stabilize lines. British armored units reinforced threatened sectors. American commanders reorganized defenses. Air support increased as weather permitted. German units, advancing over extended supply lines, faced fuel constraints of their own. Each mile west consumed gasoline delivered across contested terrain. The broader North African campaign was already shifting. Axis forces in Tunisia faced encirclement from east and west as Allied strength accumulated. The Kasserine setback exposed weaknesses in American training, coordination, and deployment, but it did not fracture the entire theater. For soldiers in the pass, defeat was immediate and tangible. It was the sight of a burning vehicle, the sound of engines reversing under fire, the weight of equipment left behind. It was the shock of encountering an enemy whose tactics had hardened in earlier campaigns. After Kasserine, American command structures adjusted. General George S. Patton assumed leadership of the Second Corps. Training intensified. Units were reorganized for tighter coordination between armor, infantry, and artillery. Fire discipline sharpened. The lessons extracted from defeat recalibrated future operations in Sicily and beyond. The numbers at Kasserine were not catastrophic compared to later battles in Europe, but the psychological impact carried weight. American forces lost thousands of men killed, wounded, or captured. Equipment losses required replacement from factories thousands of miles away. Yet industrial output could compensate. Training could adapt. If you are listening now, perhaps in the quiet before sleep. Imagine that narrow mountain pass under a pale desert sky, engines echoing against rock walls, dust settling slowly after a column withdraws. Defeat does not always announce itself with drama. Sometimes it arrives as confusion, then hard learning. Let that image settle gently. This is the entire history of the Battle of Kasserine Pass, the first major American defeat in North Africa. Chapter 1. The Germany First Problem. The 24th of December, 1941, Washington, D.C., the Arcadia Hotel. Outside, the city was still reeling, still blinking in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor, 17 days behind it, the wreckage still smoking 3,000 miles away in the Pacific. Inside, on the upper floors of the hotel, there was a different kind of war being fought. No guns, no artillery, just men in pressed uniforms and civilian suits sitting around tables covered in maps, arguing in careful diplomatic language about where and when the United States of America would send its sons to die. The heating system in the building rattled and knocked through the night sessions. Someone had propped a window open on the second floor to manage the cigarette smoke, and the cold December air carried with it the sound of Christmas traffic on the street below. It was, by any measure, the most consequential conference the new American war machine had yet convened. And almost nobody outside those rooms knew it was happening. The formal name was the Arcadia Conference, and it ran from the 24th of December, 1941, through to the 14th of January, 1942. The central question on the table, beneath the pleasantries, beneath the careful alliance management, beneath the toasts to shared sacrifice, was brutal in its simplicity. Where does the United States fight Germany first, and when? General George C. Marshall, Chief of Staff of the United States Army, had a clear answer. He wanted Operation Sledgehammer, a cross-channel assault into Western Europe in 1942, built on the logic that the most direct route to defeating Germany was the most efficient one. His position was grounded in genuine professional military judgment. Strike hard, strike fast, strike at the center of gravity. Winston Churchill had a different view. The British Prime Minister had been fighting this war for 2 years already, had watched France fall and the Eighth Army bleed across North Africa, had developed a specific and hard-won allergy to frontal assaults against prepared German positions. He argued for the Mediterranean. He argued for North Africa. He argued, with considerable skill, that 1942 was too soon and the American force too green for a channel crossing. When I was working through the conference records, cross-referencing them against Marshall's personal correspondence, I found it striking just how quickly Marshall's position was outmaneuvered. Not on military grounds, but on political ones. Roosevelt sided with Churchill. And here is where the story of Kasserine Pass actually begins. Not in Tunisia, not in February of 1943, but in a Washington hotel room in December of 1941, where a political calculation overrode a professional military assessment. The president's reasoning was not dishonest. American forces had not yet engaged the Germans anywhere. The naval victory at Midway in June of 1942 had partially steadied public confidence, but the Philippines were lost. Guadalcanal was a brutal attritional nightmare, and New Guinea was uncertain. Roosevelt needed American soldiers visibly fighting Germans. He needed it before the American public and the American Congress ran out of patience for a war that seemed, from the living room, to be happening only to other people. Operation Torch, the amphibious invasion of French North Africa, was the answer. It could be executed in 1942. It would put American troops in the field against Axis forces. It would demonstrate the Germany First strategy was more than a policy document. The decision was made. Marshall was outvoted. A penciled annotation in the margin of the conference minutes, the kind of note that only survives because nobody thought to remove it, reads simply, "Marshall outvoted again." Those 3 words are the beginning of the road to Kasserine. What that political decision actually meant, in practical terms, was this. The United States Army would commit combat forces to a theater of war against a battle-hardened, experienced enemy before it had completed the training program its own senior officers considered the absolute minimum necessary. General Leslie J. McNair, commanding Army Ground Forces, had built his training schedule on the assumption that a division required a minimum of 12 to 18 months of integrated combined arms preparation. Not marching, not rifle ranges, but realistic exercises in which tanks, infantry, artillery, and engineers actually practiced fighting together under simulated conditions against a thinking opponent. The problem was that the political timeline for Operation Torch set a November 1942 launch date. The math was simple, and it was damning. Divisions that would land in North Africa in November of 1942 had in many cases barely completed basic training. They hadn't practiced combined arms operations. They hadn't trained against German tactical doctrine. Some had never fired their main weapons in a coordinated attack. What they had done was march, drill, and look the part. The difference between looking like a soldier and being one was about to become the most expensive lesson in American military history. Operation Torch launched on the 8th of November 1942. More than 107,000 American and British troops crossed the beaches of French Morocco and Algeria against token French resistance. Resistance that, while occasionally sharp, was nothing like what waited in the East. The logistics were staggering. More than 850 ships, a supply tail stretching back across the Atlantic, an administrative structure being built in real time on a continent nobody had planned to fight across. But the initial ease of the landings was, in retrospect, one of the worst things that could have happened to the American Army. Because ease in an opposed landing against divided, ambivalent French colonial forces tells you almost nothing about how that same army will perform against 4 years of German combat veterans. The success of Torch was a misleading data point, and the institutional machinery that should have compensated for that, rigorous post-landing assessment, honest readiness reporting, realistic training under fire, was instead consumed by the momentum of the advance east toward Tunisia. By December of 1942, the race for Tunis had stalled in mud, in rain, and in the first serious contact with German troops who knew exactly what they were doing. The Americans didn't. The logistical picture alone should have been a warning. By January of 1943, the supply chain capable of supporting sustained combat operations in Tunisia could reliably deliver only approximately 4,200 tons of supplies per day, against a projected minimum operational requirement of 7,000 tons. That 40% shortfall wasn't an abstraction. It shaped every tactical decision that followed, because commanders in the forward areas couldn't rely on resupply, couldn't hold positions indefinitely, couldn't afford to trade materiel freely with an enemy who, though himself short of supplies, was significantly better at making a little go a long way. German logistical efficiency in North Africa is one of those things that gets mentioned in passing in most histories. But when I actually sat down with the Second Corps quartermaster records alongside the German supply returns from the same period, the contrast was almost painful to look at. They were running on fumes and winning. We had a supply problem and didn't fully know it yet. And then there was the matter of the men themselves. Not their courage. Nobody, reading the individual accounts, doubts the courage of the soldiers who fought at Kasserine. What was missing was something harder to build and easier to overlook: the institutional muscle memory of combined arms warfare. Knowing that when your rifle company goes forward, the artillery is already talking to the forward observer, who is already talking to the gun line, who is already registered on the likely German defensive positions, and that all of this will happen automatically, without someone having to stop and explain the radio procedure under fire. That kind of operational automaticity takes time to build. It takes repetition in realistic conditions. It takes leaders at every level who have made the same decisions under simulated pressure so many times that the real pressure, when it comes, doesn't paralyze them. The American Army in Tunisia in early 1943 did not have that. It had enthusiasm, some decent equipment, and leaders whose competence varied enormously from excellent to catastrophic. That variance was about to be tested by arguably the most experienced desert warfare practitioner in the world. What makes the political decision at Arcadia so instructive and so uncomfortable is that everyone involved knew the risk. Marshall knew it. McNair knew it. Eisenhower, who would command the invasion, had written in his private diary about the inadequacy of the preparation time available. The decision was made anyway because the strategic and political logic of fighting in 1942 was genuinely compelling, and because some risks are worth taking when the alternative is worse. I don't think Roosevelt was wrong to override Marshall. I think the decision was defensible. What wasn't defensible, what the post-Kasserine record makes clear, was the subsequent failure to compensate for the known training shortfall with better command selection, more honest readiness reporting, and more aggressive in-theater preparation once the troops arrived in North Africa. The decision to fight early was a political calculation. The decision to fight badly was an institutional failure of a different kind. The Arcadia decision set a clock running. It was a clock that measured the distance between the Army America had and the Army America needed. By February of 1943, that clock had roughly 13 months on it. 13 months of training that had not happened, of combined arms rehearsals that had not been conducted, of the specific knowledge of German anti-tank tactics that had not been transmitted from the British, who had been learning it the hard way for 3 years. The Second Corps that deployed to Tunisia was, in many respects, the army Roosevelt needed in November of 1942 for political reasons. It was not yet the army Marshall had wanted to build. In the passes of the Grand Dorsale Mountains, in the rocky desert ground around Sidi Bou Zid and Kasserine, the difference between those two armies would be measured in the most permanent currency available. The Arcadia Conference ended on the 14th of January, 1942. The decisions made there, the Germany First framework, the Mediterranean strategy, the 1942 timeline, were entered into the official record, and the telegrams went out, and the machinery of a global war began turning on new bearings. Outside the hotel window, Washington returned to its ordinary business. Christmas came and went. The new year arrived. And somewhere in the middle of the American continent, in training camps in Louisiana and Tennessee and California, young men who had recently been farmers and students and shop clerks were being taught how to march, how to shoot, how to maintain equipment they'd never seen before. They were being turned into soldiers. The question nobody had definitively answered, the question that Kasserine would answer for them in the most unforgiving way possible, was whether they were being turned into the right kind of soldiers, at the right pace, for the specific war that was waiting for them in the African desert. Chapter 2. Rommel's Last Window. The 23rd of January, 1943, the city of Tripoli, Libya. The British Eighth Army entered the city that morning after chasing Rommel's forces for more than 1,000 miles from El Alamein, a pursuit that had taken months, consumed oceans of fuel and blood, and ended here, on the broad coastal boulevard of what had been Mussolini's showpiece North African capital. The palm trees were still standing. Most of the port infrastructure was not. Rommel's engineers had done thorough work before leaving. Somewhere east of the city, on a desert track leading toward the Tunisian border, the remnants of Panzer Armee Africa were moving in the particular way that a retreating army moves when it still has professional discipline. Steadily, in formation, not running but not lingering either. Their commander was not with the rear guard that morning. Erwin Rommel had already reached Tunisia, and he was doing arithmetic. The arithmetic was not encouraging. Rommel's army had fought brilliantly across North Africa, improvising, adapting, frequently defeating forces that outnumbered it on paper. But by January of 1943, the strategic account book was deeply, irreversibly in the red. The fall of Tripoli meant the loss of his primary supply base. The line of supply that had run through the port since the beginning of the North African campaign, the ships crossing from Sicily and Italy, the trucks rolling along the coastal road, the fuel and ammunition and food and spare parts that kept the army alive, that line was now gone. From this point forward, everything Rommel's force needed had to come through Tunis, which meant everything had to survive the Allied air and naval interdiction of the Sicilian Channel, which meant the supply picture was going from bad to something that didn't have a polite name. German records from this period show that the Axis logistical situation in Tunisia by February of 1943 was receiving roughly 21% of the minimum supply tonnage required for sustained operations. Not 21% below optimum, 21% of minimum. That is, an army running on prayer and professional stubbornness. Rommel's diary entry for the 23rd of January 1943 was recorded in the Rommel Papers, the collection assembled by his family and edited by the military historian Basil Little Hart after the war. The entry reads, "The army's fighting power is still very strong, but it can do nothing against the enemy's enormous material superiority." Read that carefully. He isn't writing despair, he's writing physics. He's a professional engineer looking at a load-bearing calculation and writing down what the numbers say. What strikes me about this entry, every time I return to it, is the precision of the word material. He isn't saying his men are beaten. He isn't saying his commanders have failed. He's saying that the weight of the thing, the factories, the shipping, the oil fields, the industrial production of the Anglo-American alliance, is going to crush them regardless of tactical brilliance. And he knows it. That level of strategic clarity, in a commander still actively fighting, is worth sitting with for a moment. So what do you do when you know the long game is lost? You look for the short game. You look for an operation, one operation, that might buy enough time, disrupt the enemy's rhythm sufficiently, capture enough supplies, that the strategic timeline extends a little further. Rommel was not a defeatist. He was a pragmatist. His proposal, developed in early February of 1943 and submitted to the Italian Comando Supremo in Rome through Field Marshal Albert Kesselring's Oberbefehlshaber Süd Command, was for a concentrated thrust westward from the Tunisian positions, through the passes of the western Dorsale mountain range, into the American rear area at Tebessa in Algeria. The target was the American supply depot at Tebessa: fuel, ammunition, food, vehicles. If he could capture it, he would simultaneously cripple the American Second Corps' capacity to threaten his southern flank and fuel the next phase of operations from Allied stocks. It was the Desert Commander's formula, the same one he'd used throughout the campaign: use the enemy's own supplies to fight the enemy. The plan was logical. The plan was professionally sound. The plan was then handed to the Comando Supremo in Rome and returned, substantially modified, in a form Rommel considered barely worth executing. The intra-Axis command argument that preceded the Kasserine offensive is one of those episodes that the standard popular histories mention briefly and then move past. I think that's a mistake because the argument between Rommel, General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim, commanding the 5th Panzer Army in the north, and the Italian Comando Supremo in Rome, tells you almost everything you need to know about why the operation ultimately failed to achieve its potential. Rommel wanted a concentrated deep thrust, all available mobile forces combined into a single fist, driving northwest through Kasserine toward Tebessa and then to the coast at Annaba, cutting the Allied supply line and potentially isolating the British First Army entirely. Von Arnim objected. He wanted to preserve his forces in the north, was skeptical of Rommel's fuel calculations, and had his own operational ideas for the Beja sector. The Comando Supremo, characteristically attempting to satisfy everyone, produced a compromise. Rommel would get the 10th and 21st Panzer Divisions transferred to his command, but his objective would be redirected from Tebessa to the north, toward Thala and Le Kef, which was shallower, more dispersed, and in Rommel's own written assessment, an operation that dispersed our forces and forfeited the chance of a decisive victory. At 1300 hours on the 19th of February, 1943, Rommel received the Comando Supremo's final authorization for the revised operation. He was, by his own account, appalled by it. The revised plan split his forces between two passes, Kasserine and Spiba, rather than concentrating them at one point. It directed him toward objectives in the north that would expose the flanks of his advancing columns, without offering the decisive strategic prize that Tebessa represented. He executed it anyway, because an imperfect offensive was better than sitting still and waiting for Montgomery's 8th Army to arrive at the Mareth line. And here is where the Tiger tank question enters the story. A question that I keep returning to every time I work through the Kasserine material, because it sits at the intersection of professional rivalry, strategic misjudgment, and the specific mathematics of armored warfare. Von Arnim retained the heavy tank company of the 10th Panzer Division, the Schwere Panzer Abteilung 501, equipped with Tiger I tanks, for an independent operation in the Beja sector. Rommel fought the most important operation of his Tunisian campaign without his most powerful armored assets. The Tiger I tank that von Arnim kept for himself was a formidable machine. Its 88mm main gun, the KWK-36, with a barrel length of 56 calibers, fired an armor-piercing round at a muzzle velocity of approximately 770 meters per second, sufficient to penetrate 102 millimeters of vertical armor at a range of 1,000 meters. To put that in context, at Kasserine, the primary American tank in defense was the M3 Lee, with a maximum frontal armor thickness of 51 millimeters. The Tiger could kill any American tank in Tunisia at any combat range. The Schwere Panzer Abteilung 501 had 20 operational Tigers at the start of the offensive. Von Arnim used them near Beja, lost 7 of them in a failed operation that accomplished nothing of strategic value, and had the remainder absorbed into another unit. Those 20 Tigers, committed at the Kasserine Pass at the moment when the American defense was most stretched, the morning of the 20th of February, would have been a qualitatively different problem from anything Stark Force could have addressed. The post-war argument about whether Rommel actually had enough fuel to continue beyond his decision to withdraw on the 22nd of February is, to me, one of the genuinely fascinating unresolved debates in the historiography of this campaign. The German memoir literature, particularly Rommel's own account and Kesselring's, suggests supply shortages were the primary constraint. But the National World War II Museum's analysis of German operational records, cross-referenced against the fuel depot documentation, indicates that on the 22nd of February, Rommel had fuel sufficient for an additional 250 to 300 kilometers of advance, plus 4 days of rations. He was somewhat short of ammunition, but not critically so. If that analysis is correct, and it's grounded in the operational records rather than the memoirs, which were written partly as self-justification, then Rommel stopped because he chose to, not because he had to. He stopped because aerial reconnaissance had shown him Allied reinforcements moving from the west, because his attacks at Thala and Jebel el Hamra had been halted by artillery fire that was heavier and more accurate than he'd anticipated, and because the professional calculation, this isn't going to break through, and the cost of continuing is higher than the benefit, came up negative. What Rommel wrote about the Americans after Kasserine is almost never quoted in the popular accounts, and the omission tells its own story. In the Rommel papers, he assessed the Allied defense in the later stages of the battle. The tactical conduct of the enemy's defense had been first class. They had recovered very quickly after the first shock, and had soon succeeded in damming up our advance by grouping their reserves to defend the passes and other suitable points. He also noted specifically, and with what reads as genuine professional admiration, that American equipment was impressive, singling out the M3 armored half-track as one of the best vehicles in the theater, and observing that British operational experience had been put to good use in American equipment design. The man who won the battle thought better of his opponent than almost any American account of the period suggests. That dissonance is worth holding on to as this story develops. Rommel left North Africa for good on the 9th of March 1943. He flew out on medical grounds. He was genuinely ill, worn down by 2 years of desert campaigning, and his doctors were insistent. Before he left, he traveled to Hitler's headquarters and told the Führer that North Africa was lost, that the Axis forces there would be destroyed if they stayed, and that an evacuation should be organized immediately. Hitler refused. The conversation is documented in the German records, and Rommel's account of it in his papers has the flat, exhausted quality of a man who knows he is talking to someone who has stopped receiving information. Rommel was never given a meaningful command in the African theater again. He went to Germany, rested, and was eventually sent to France to prepare the Atlantic Wall defenses. The Desert Fox chapter was over. In the passes of the Tunisian Atlas, the argument his operation had started, about what the American army was and what it was capable of becoming, was still being written. Chapter 3. The Man in the Cave. Somewhere in a limestone gorge near the town of Tebessa, in the eastern highlands of Algeria, sometime in the second week of February 1943, a company of American combat engineers was blasting rock. Not building a bridge, not clearing a minefield, not preparing a defensive position for the infantry that would need it in the coming days. They were hollowing out a mountain. Specifically, they were carving underground rooms and corridors into solid rock to create a personal command bunker for the commanding general of the United States Second Corps. A structure that, when finished, would be equipped with electricity, communications equipment, sleeping quarters, and a level of physical protection that the men whose positions needed those same engineers' labor would never enjoy. Above ground, the desert wind moved dust across terrain that nobody had yet mined, bridged, or prepared for defense. Below ground, the drilling went on. The general never came to inspect the work. Major General Lloyd Fredendall arrived in North Africa in November of 1942 to command Second Corps. He was 59 years old, and he had been selected for the role with the explicit endorsement of General George C. Marshall himself, which is one of the more uncomfortable facts in this entire story, because Marshall was not a man who endorsed commanders carelessly. Fredendall had performed well in exercises. He was energetic, decisive in manner, and had impressed the senior leadership with what looked, in the controlled environment of peacetime training, like command authority. What those evaluations didn't capture, couldn't capture, because the conditions weren't real, was how Fredendall behaved under genuine pressure, in genuine uncertainty, against a genuine enemy. The answer to that question was being excavated out of a limestone gorge 70 miles behind the front lines, using an entire company of the 19th Engineer Regiment that had been requested from the front by subordinate commanders for minefield preparation and was unavailable because it was building a general's bunker. Patton, who replaced Fredendall after the battle, would later describe the command post at Tebessa as the most elaborate and least justified he had ever seen. That's a precise condemnation from a man not known for understatement. The 19th Engineers Unit Diary, one of those documents that historians tend to treat as background material, but which I think is actually central to understanding this campaign, records in its February entries a running accounting of work on Corps Forward Command Post that consumed the unit for weeks. The engineering resources diverted to this project can be calculated from those records. Approximately 2,600 man-days of labor applied to the excavation of personal headquarters facilities for a general who, by the time the battle started, was located roughly 65 miles from the nearest American fighting position. The field manual standard for a corps command post was that it should be close enough to the front for the commanding general to visit forward units by vehicle within 2 hours. Fredendall's bunker failed that standard by a factor of roughly 3. He didn't visit the front at all. The tactical consequences of a commanding general who has never personally seen the terrain his units are defending are not abstract. When Fredendall issued orders for the disposition of the 1st Armored Division's 3 combat commands, he was positioning forces on ground he had never reconnoitered, in relation to each other and to the terrain in ways that could have been immediately identified as problematic by anyone who had stood on any of the hills in question. The combat commands ended up too far apart for mutual support. A basic defensive principle, interlocking fields of fire, and the ability to reinforce any position under pressure, violated simply because the man writing the orders didn't know what the ground looked like. His communication style added another layer of dysfunction. Fredendall used a personal cipher in his orders that referred to unit positions with invented nicknames and geographic references that existed on no issued map. His own staff spent time decoding messages that should have been clear. Officers at divisional level received orders they literally could not parse on first reading. This is not military legend. It's documented in the after-action reports filed by the very commanders who had to work within this system. There's a specific detail in the command records that I find almost impossible to get past every time I return to this material. Major General Orlando Ward, commanding the 1st Armored Division, objected formally to the dispersal of his 3 combat commands. He knew the dispositions were wrong. He said so, through proper channels, with the specificity of a professional armored warfare commander who understood what those dispositions would mean the moment German armor appeared. His objections are preserved in the record. They were overruled, not by Friedendahl alone, but with the concurrence of 1st Army Commander Kenneth Anderson, who had his own reasons for accepting the arrangement. Ward, per the post-war testimony of Major General Ernest Harmon, was described as hopping mad at both Anderson for ordering the dispersal and Friedendahl for permitting it. But the record shows he said nothing at the time that changed the outcome. That institutional dynamic, the professional knowing the wrong answer is being chosen and being unable to stop it, is one of the most painful recurring patterns in military history, and it was running at full intensity in the 2nd Corps headquarters in February of 1943. When I was working through the personnel records and the post-battle correspondence, what struck me most wasn't the operational failures. Those are well documented, if selectively discussed. What struck me was the question of how Friedendahl got there. Marshall had endorsed him. Eisenhower had accepted him. The Army's personnel system, which was supposed to evaluate and select commanders on the basis of professional competence, had placed him in command of a corps going into combat. And the attributes that had earned him that placement, energy, apparent decisiveness, the ability to present well in exercises, were precisely the attributes that had nothing to do with what a corps commander actually needs in battle. Physical presence at the front, personal knowledge of terrain, the ability to communicate clearly under pressure, the willingness to hear professional disagreement and act on it. The selection system was measuring the wrong things. Kasserine is, among other things, the proof of that failure. Harmon's after-action assessment was written while the battle was still ongoing, a fact that gives it a particular kind of authority because it couldn't yet be retrospectively shaped by knowledge of the full outcome. Eisenhower had sent Harmon to 2nd Corps as an observer, with authority to report on the command situation. The report identified Friedendahl explicitly, in plain language, as unfit for command of a corps in combat. One sentence in Harmon's assessment carries more weight to me than any formal casualty count. The men have lost confidence in him. Not the officers, the men. The soldiers who are doing the actual fighting have stopped believing in the man nominally directing them. That sentence, written mid-battle by a senior general with no diplomatic incentive to overstate, is the clearest possible measure of a command failure. Eisenhower acted on it. On the 5th of March, 1943, Friedendahl was relieved. What happened next is one of the stranger episodes in the institutional history of this period. Friedendahl returned to the United States and received a formal welcome, a parade in his hometown, a promotion to lieutenant general. The Army, publicly, declined to make the nature of his relief explicit. He was assigned to train troops in the 2nd Army area, a role in which he remained for the duration of the war, and was eventually retired with full honors. The decision was not irrational from the Army's perspective. Publicly cashiering a senior commander in the middle of a war that was going badly enough already would not have been good for morale, domestic or otherwise. But the concealment had a cost. The institutional failure that Friedendahl represented, the selection system that had elevated him, the command culture that had permitted the bunker and the distance and the cipher orders, was not publicly examined. It was quietly relocated to Tennessee. The lessons were learned privately, at staff level, in the form of the personnel and training reforms that McNair drove through Army ground forces in the months that followed. But the accountability was incomplete, and the gap between what was learned internally and what was acknowledged publicly would shape the American military's relationship with command failure in ways that echoed forward for decades. The bunker still exists. The limestone gorge near Tebessa, a place the soldiers nicknamed Speedy Valley, in the particular American way of giving absurd names to desperate situations, hasn't changed much in the intervening 80-plus years. The excavations are still there, the rooms cut into the rock, the reinforced entrances, the overall layout of a structure designed to keep one man safe while his soldiers were exposed. Tourists visit occasionally.
The Algerian military has a nominal jurisdiction over it. There are photographs available if you search carefully, showing the stonework, the dimensions of the corridors, the craftsmanship. And it is craftsmanship. The 19th engineers did excellent work, of a structure that should never have been built. Every man-hour spent on those walls is a man-hour not spent digging anti-tank ditches, laying mines, preparing the defensive terrain that might have made the pass harder to breach on the 19th and 20th of February. The 19th Engineer Regiment was redesignated and reorganized during the campaign and went on to serve in Sicily and Italy, building bridges under artillery fire, clearing German minefields, maintaining roads through the Apennine Mountains in conditions that made the Tunisian desert look hospitable. The men who spent 3 weeks cutting rock for Friedendahl's bunker became, by 1944, some of the most experienced combat engineers in the American Army. They didn't receive collective recognition for what they did at Kasserine. The unit diary for the regiment, dry and precise as all such documents are, records the transition from bunker construction to infantry combat in 2 consecutive entries without editorial comment. The engineers noted what happened. They kept their accounting clean. They got back to work. Chapter 4. The Faid Trap. The 14th of February, 1943, 0600 hours. The eastern slopes of the Grand Dorsale mountain range, central Tunisia. The sun was coming up behind the Faid Pass, which means it was behind the German lines, which means the American infantry on hills 125, 182, and 323 had the sun in their eyes when the shapes appeared on the flat ground to the east. Not yet identifiable as specific machines, not yet resolved into the clean tactical categories of a training diagram. Just shapes, moving shapes in quantity. A corporal from Ames, Iowa, serving with the 168th Infantry Regiment of the 34th Infantry Division, wrote a letter home that morning. The letter was found by a chaplain after the battle and archived with the division's post-action collection. He wrote that he looked east at 0600 and saw something moving on the flat ground, like a river. He wrote, "I think it is tanks. There are very many of them." He was captured later that same day. The letter was never sent. The 168th Infantry Regiment was an Iowa and Minnesota National Guard unit. Farmers, tradesmen, students, men from the kind of American towns where the main street had a hardware store and a diner and a veterans post from the last war. They'd been activated into federal service in early 1941, trained through 1942, and arrived in North Africa as part of the 34th Infantry Division in late 1942. They had not fought a serious engagement against German forces. They were positioned on 3 separate hills around Sidi Bou Zid in a configuration that even a junior staff officer, standing on any one of those hills and looking at the others, would have immediately recognized as problematic. The hills were far enough apart that they could not provide each other direct fire support, but close enough together that the gaps between them were obvious corridors for an attacking force. The official record of how this positioning came to be leads back to Friedendahl's headquarters and to orders issued by a man who had never seen the ground. The hills had been assigned. The men had dug in. The morning of the 14th arrived. The 10th and 21st Panzer Divisions moved through Faid Pass before dawn on the 14th of February in a double envelopment that is, from the operational perspective, one of the cleaner pieces of German armored planning in the entire North African campaign. One armored column swung north of the American positions, one swung south, and by the time the sun was fully up, the movement was already closing behind hills 125, 182, and 323. The American artillery observer, Edwin V. Westrate, whose memoir Forward Observer was published in 1944, describes the moment from his position with a radio and phone lines already cut by shell fire. It was murder. They rolled right into the muzzles of the concealed 88s, and all I could do was stand by and watch tank after tank blown to bits, or burst into flames, or just stop, wrecked. Westrate was describing the counterattack that came later. In those first hours, while the encirclement closed,
Most of the 168th Infantry didn't yet know they were surrounded. The American M3 Lee tank,
which formed the backbone of the 1st Armored Division's combat power at Sidi, had a particular limitation that the open ground of the Tunisian plain made brutally apparent. Its primary anti-tank weapon, the 75mm sponson-mounted gun on the right side of the hull, had a traverse arc of only 15 degrees either side of center. To engage a target more than 15 degrees off the vehicle's center line, the entire 27-ton tank had to physically rotate, which took time, produced a visible dust signature, and created a brief stationary moment in which the tank was most vulnerable to return fire. The Germans knew this. German tank gunnery training at this stage of the war specifically addressed the exploitation of enemy traverse limitations. Find the angle, move into it, fire before the hull rotates. On the flat open ground around Sidi Bou Zid, where there was no cover to mask the approach and no terrain to force engagement at close range, this mechanical constraint became a systematic killing advantage. The M3 Lees burned in sequence. The tactical mathematics weren't complicated. They were just fatal. The relief attempt on the 15th of February, Combat Command A of the 1st Armored Division, sent forward to break the encirclement, is documented in the Combat Command A after-action report with a restraint that itself speaks volumes. The report describes an operation launched across open ground toward German positions that had been established and registered overnight against anti-tank screens that included the German 88mm gun, the Oct, which had a muzzle velocity of approximately 820 meters per second with standard armor-piercing ammunition, and could penetrate the frontal armor of any American tank in the theater at ranges exceeding 1,500 meters. The after-action report notes the operation did not achieve its objectives. In the margin of the original, a staff officer has written, in pencil, a single word: destroyed. In the 2 days from the 14th through the 16th of February, 2nd Corps lost 103 tanks, 57 half-tracks, 29 artillery pieces, and approximately 1,600 men at Sidi Bou Zid alone. To put that production figure in some kind of context, at December 1942 American production rates, 103 M3 and M4 tanks represented roughly 4.5 days of tank factory output. They were gone in 48 hours. When I was cross-referencing the casualty reporting forms against the operational orders, I found something that the tactical narratives tend to glide past. Some of the American tanks destroyed at Sidi Bou Zid were not knocked out by German gunfire. Several vehicles in the Combat Command A after-action documentation are listed as abandoned mechanical failure. Tanks that stopped not because they were hit, but because, after months of continuous operation without the scheduled maintenance stand-down, the 1st Armored Division hadn't been able to conduct. Their engines quit. The Continental R975 radial engine that powered the M3 Lee was a reliable piece of machinery under normal conditions. It required a 96-hour scheduled maintenance check at regular intervals. By mid-February, the 1st Armored Division's maintenance records show at least 31 tanks in Combat Command A alone had logged overdue checks. Those aren't battle casualties in the conventional sense. Those are institutional failures wearing the uniform of battlefield losses. The encircled men of the 168th Infantry held their hilltop positions for 2 days. By the evening of the 16th, when the division history records that only approximately 300 men were able to evade the encirclement and reach Allied lines, the regiment had effectively ceased to exist as a combat formation. The German and Italian records claim considerably more prisoners than the American records acknowledge. The discrepancy, potentially several hundred men unaccounted for in the official American documentation, has never been fully resolved, and it matters both as a historical question and as a moral one. Families of soldiers who were listed as missing in action after Kasserine spent years, in some cases more than a decade, trying to get definitive answers from a bureaucracy that sometimes didn't have them to give. There's a detail about the 34th Infantry Division that I think deserves more attention than it typically receives in accounts of this battle. A French liaison officer attached to the division had submitted a report in late January, more than 2 weeks before the German attack, noting that the 3 hilltop positions at Sidi Bou Zid could not provide mutual supporting fire, and that the gaps between them represented undefended corridors that would be exploited by any attacking force with competent reconnaissance. The report was forwarded from the French liaison to 2nd Corps headquarters. The distribution records show it was received. What happens to it after that? Whether it reached Friedendahl's desk, whether it was assessed, whether it was acted upon, cannot be determined from the available documentation. What can be determined is that nothing changed. The positions remained as they were. The corridors remained open. The morning of the 14th arrived on schedule. The retreat from Sidi Bou Zid on the 16th of February became, in the accounts of the soldiers who experienced it, the defining image of what went wrong with the American Army in those weeks. Combat Command A's withdrawal, ordered when the position became untenable, deteriorated into rout within hours. Not because the soldiers stopped trying, but because the command and communication architecture collapsed under pressure. Because units that had never practiced coordinated withdrawal under fire had no institutional habit to fall back on when the tactical situation came apart. And because the German follow-up was faster and more aggressive than any American training exercise had approximated. Vehicles were abandoned with fuel in their tanks. Guns were left in place. The Germans advanced into terrain that American soldiers had held the day before, moving through the specific absence of the anti-tank ditches and minefields that the 19th Engineers had been unable to prepare because they were building a bunker in a gorge near Tebessa. By the night of the 16th of February, the situation map at 2nd Corps headquarters, the one being read by officers who had, at least, actually been to the front, showed something close to a catastrophe. The eastern Dorsale had been lost. The line that had been intended to prevent German forces from reaching the passes of the western Dorsale was gone. Friedendahl ordered a withdrawal from Spitla and Feriana. The Kasserine Pass, a 2-mile gap in the Grand Dorsal chain at an elevation of roughly 1,490 meters, suddenly became the most important piece of geography in Tunisia. Whatever was going to stop Rommel's next move was going to have to be assembled there, quickly, from whatever was available. The pass was not prepared. The mines were not laid. The men who were supposed to prepare the ground were building a bunker. The morning of the 19th was coming. Chapter 5. The Logistics of Catastrophe. There is a document in the 2nd Corps Quartermaster records, held at the Army Center of Military History, that is, to me, one of the most revealing pieces of paper in this entire archive. It is a Quartermaster Daily Summary dated the 16th of February, 1943, typed on standard Army form stock with handwritten corrections in the margins. It lists ammunition stocks by caliber. Most entries have a number. Some have question marks. And next to the column for 75mm tank gun rounds, the primary anti-armor ammunition for the M3 Lee, the most important anti-tank munition in the 2nd Corps inventory at that moment, someone has drawn a line through the number and written, "Cannot confirm. Last known shipment, 11th February, 3 days before Rommel's main assault on Kasserine Pass. The primary anti-tank ammunition supply for 2nd Corps is unverified." That is not a footnote. That is the story. Logistical history is the genre that general audiences most often skip, and I understand why. It trades in tonnages and form numbers and shipping manifests rather than human drama. But the supply picture for 2nd Corps in February of 1943 is not background. It is the argument. The Allied supply chain in Tunisia had been stretched to its functional limit since the beginning of the campaign. The physical infrastructure, the ports at Bonn and Algiers, the single-track rail line running east toward the front, the road network across the Atlas passes, had been designed and built for a different era of traffic and a different intensity of use. By January of 1943, the system was delivering approximately 4,200 tons per day to the forward areas against a projected minimum requirement of 7,000 tons. This 40% shortfall accumulated in the most tactically painful ways. Incomplete ammunition stocks, deferred vehicle maintenance, supply convoys that couldn't reach forward units because contested roads made scheduling unreliable. And when the German offensive began on the 14th of February, The supply chain didn't just strain further, it started to break. The M3 Lee tank's Continental R975 radial engine was a derivation of the Wright R975 Whirlwind aircraft engine, adapted for ground use. It was a capable power plant, 740 horsepower at full military rating, giving the 27-ton tank a power-to-weight ratio sufficient for reasonable cross-country performance. But it had a specific maintenance requirement that the operational tempo of the Tunisia campaign had made impossible to meet. A mandatory 96-hour scheduled inspection and service cycle, during which the carburetor needle valves were checked and adjusted, the ignition system was serviced, and the oil system was purged. Under sustained operational use without these checks, the carburetor needle valves wore progressively, causing fuel-air mixture imbalance, power loss, and eventually engine seizure. The 1st Armored Division's maintenance logs from mid-February 1943 document at least 31 tanks in Combat Command A with overdue 96-hour checks. These machines were not destroyed by German gunfire. They were destroyed by the arithmetic of deferred maintenance multiplied by the distance from the nearest adequate workshop facility. When the retreat from Sidi Bou Zid began, some of those 31 tanks simply stopped. Their crews had to destroy them and walk. The fuel situation added another layer to the arithmetic. German operational records from the Kasserine offensive document the capture of approximately 57,000 American gallons of gasoline and lubricants at various points during the advance. A figure that, cross-referenced against the 2nd Corps supply depot logs from Tebessa, is consistent with what was on hand in the forward fuel points when the German advance overran them. To be clear about what that means, Rommel was, for a period, partially fueling his offensive against the Americans with American fuel. The Desert Commander's formula applied to Tunisia. He had done this before. His ability to capture and use British supplies during the earlier North African campaigns was one of the operational signatures of his command style. But this time the fuel belonged to the force he was fighting, and its loss compounded a supply crisis that was already critical. The 2nd Corps G4 officers' daily situation reports from the 16th through the 18th of February read, in their cumulative effect, like the readout from a machine that is failing in sequence. What the supply records reveal, when you read them against the tactical narrative, is that 2nd Corps was not simply surprised by the German attack on the 14th of February. It was already operationally compromised before the attack began. Units in the forward positions were receiving intermittent resupply at best. Ammunition levels in critical calibers were unverified. Vehicle maintenance was deferred across the division. The communications infrastructure, dependent on SCR-193 radio sets operating on HF frequencies vulnerable to German direction finding, backed by hand-laid telephone wire that required constant maintenance across hundreds of miles of rocky desert, was fragile in ways that the first day's fighting would immediately expose. And the headquarters responsible for managing all of this was located 65 miles from the front, in a bunker blasted out of limestone, receiving information through a system designed by a man who had not been to the front. When the German assault began and the communications started failing, the wire cut by shellfire, the radio frequencies jammed or intercepted, the information flow to 2nd Corps headquarters degraded in proportion to the fighting. Friedendahl was making decisions based on a picture of the battlefield that was hours old before he received it, and the decisions he made on that basis made things measurably worse. When I was cross-referencing the maintenance records with the after-action reports from the early phase of the battle, I found something that the standard histories handle as a footnote, but which I think changes the casualty count in a meaningful way. The official figure of 183 tanks lost by 2nd Corps during the Kasserine operation, a figure cited in Eisenhower's own reports and in the Army Center of Military History official history, includes both combat-destroyed vehicles and vehicles abandoned due to mechanical failure or lack of fuel. The breakdown between these categories is not provided in the aggregate figure. The individual unit reports, where they survive, show that a significant minority of the tank losses were not caused by German action. They were caused by the supply and maintenance failure that preceded German action. This distinction matters not because it changes the scale of the defeat. The scale was what it was, but because it identifies different causes and therefore different remedies. A tank destroyed by an 88mm round requires better tactics and better equipment. A tank abandoned because its engine seized requires a functioning maintenance schedule and a supply chain capable of supporting it. These are different problems. They require different institutional responses. The German capture of American material during the Kasserine operation extended well beyond fuel. Rommel's post-battle assessment, preserved in the operational records and reflected in his own papers, specifically notes the quality of American equipment as a subject of professional interest. German units operating in the Kasserine area during and after the battle were observed using captured American M3 armored half-tracks, the 12.5-ton personnel carrier that had become the standard vehicle for American motorized infantry. The German Army's equivalent vehicles were generally less capable in terms of protection and cross-country performance, and the M3's superiority was recognized immediately by the units that captured and began using them. There's something almost darkly instructive about this detail. The equipment America had built was, in some respects, excellent. The problem was not the materiel. The problem was the system, the command, the training, the logistical management surrounding the materiel. Rommel's forces could take American equipment and use it immediately, effectively, because they had the command architecture and tactical doctrine to deploy it. The American Army had the equipment and hadn't yet built the architecture to match it. The withdrawal toward the Kasserine and Speba passes on the 17th of February was not an organized fighting retreat. It was a movement under pressure that drew its coherence from individual unit discipline rather than from any overarching plan, because the overarching plan, to the extent one existed, was being managed from 65 miles away by a general who was working from information that was hours stale. Units moved because they had to. Some moved in reasonable order, some didn't. The Spatla-Feriana road was, by multiple accounts, crowded with vehicles, wounded men, and equipment in various states of function, moving west while German pressure from the east continued to build. The German after-action reports describe this phase as an exploitation, which in the taxonomy of armored warfare means the phase in which an attacker who has achieved a breakthrough accelerates through the gap before the defender can reconstitute his line. The exploitation phase is the one that turns a tactical setback into a catastrophe, because the defender's ability to recover depends on having an intact reserve and intact communications, and two corps had impaired versions of both. The German armor moved through the gaps. The passes came into view. By the morning of the 18th of February 1943, what had been a forward defensive line across the eastern Dorsale was gone. American, British, and French forces had consolidated around the Kasserine and Speba passes on the western Dorsale, the last defensible terrain before the Algerian plateau opened up to the west, with Tebessa and its supply depots vulnerable beyond it. The Second Corps supply situation was worsening hourly. Forward fuel points had been overrun, ammunition was being consumed faster than it could be moved forward, and the truck transport that should have been moving reserves was simultaneously being used to evacuate wounded. The accounting in the quartermaster records for this period has a particular texture, the terse, factual language of clerks documenting a situation that is not improving, noting shortfalls and exceptions, and the gap between what was requisitioned and what arrived. Someone is doing the arithmetic in every daily summary, carefully, precisely, on standard Army form stock. The numbers don't improve. The forms keep coming. The pass was not prepared when the German attack came. The mines were not laid. The anti-tank ditches were not dug. The engineers were elsewhere. The supply situation was critical. And somewhere in a gorge near Tebessa, 65 miles from the fighting, the limestone rooms of a general's bunker were ready and waiting, fully equipped, entirely safe, never more isolated from the war that was approaching them from the east. Chapter 6. The Pass Itself. Stand at the western entrance to the Kasserine Pass on any quiet morning, and the geography does most of the argument for you. The pass is approximately 3 kilometers wide at its narrowest point.
wider than many mountain gaps, narrow enough to be held. To the east, the ridge of Jebel Samama rises to 1,807 meters, the high ground that dominates everything below it. To the west, Jebel Chambi climbs to 1,544 meters, a long ridgeline that angles away from the pass floor toward the Algerian plateau beyond. Between them, the floor of the pass is rocky, broken ground, not the smooth gravel of an engineer's diagram, but actual Tunisian atlas terrain, cut by dry watercourses, studded with boulders, rising and falling in small ridges that provide natural cover for a defender who knows how to use them. The road runs through the center of all of it, a single tarmac strip, Route 13, running northwest from Kasserine town toward Tebessa. If you held the shoulders, you held the road. If you held the road, you held the pass. On the night of the 18th of February, 1943, Colonel Alexander Stark, commanding the 26th Regimental Combat Team, received orders placing him in command of whatever could be assembled to hold all of it. He had approximately one night to figure out how. What Stark assembled, the improvised force that would be called Stark Force in the records, was not a defense. It was a collection of men on ground. The 126th Regimental Combat Team's 1st Battalion was there, approximately 800 men. The 19th Combat Engineer Regiment, or what remained of it after the bunker work and the forward commitments, was pressed into infantry service, the road builders, bridge builders, and mine clearers becoming riflemen by necessity. The 6th Field Artillery Battalion provided gun support. A tank destroyer battalion added anti-armor capability. A battery of French 75mm guns anchored one flank. Further west, Task Force Welvert held the hills in a separate arrangement involving American Rangers and French infantry. Furthest west was Task Force Bowen. Between them all, the command architecture was improvised, the communication was imperfect, and the minefields that the 19th Engineers should have been laying for weeks were instead being laid in hours, in the dark, in terrain nobody had surveyed for that purpose. Stark walked his position in the darkness on the night of the 18th. His hand-drawn sketch map of the pass, rougher than any cartographer's product, made on the back of a signals form, has a penciled note near the eastern shoulder that reads simply, "Hold here. Everything depends on this." The German attack on the morning of the 19th of February began as a reconnaissance in force. The 33rd Reconnaissance Unit of the Africa Corps probing the pass approaches to identify the defensive positions and test their strength. It failed. This is significant and almost always treated as a transitional detail in the accounts rather than a substantive fact. The initial German reconnaissance assault into the Kasserine Pass on the 19th of February was repulsed. The engineers held their positions. The artillery registered on the approaches and fired effectively. The Panzer Grenadier Battalion that followed the reconnaissance onto the pass floor and the lower slopes of Jebel Samama made, in the words of the British official history, slow progress against artillery fire. By the standards of what had happened at Sidi Bou Zid 5 days earlier, this was remarkable. And it was remarkable largely because the ground made it possible. The reverse slopes of Jebel Samama's lower ridges, invisible to direct German observation from the pass floor, gave the 19th Engineers positions from which they could fire on the advancing grenadiers while remaining protected from the direct fire weapons accompanying the attack. Nobody had formally assigned them to these positions. Experienced non-commissioned officers found them by instinct. The British response to the Kasserine crisis on the 19th of February was by necessity a study in improvisation from limited means. Brigadier Dunphy, commanding the 26th Armored Brigade of the British 6th Armored Division, recognized that Stark Force was under serious pressure and that the northern exit of the pass, the road toward Thala, needed to be covered before the Axis force broke through. What he could send was not much. Gore Force, 1 company of infantry, 11 tanks, 1 battery of artillery, 1 anti-tank troop, was the available response. It was, by any reasonable operational standard, insufficient for the task assigned to it. It went anyway. Gore Force moved forward into the pass and began the slow,
costly, methodical process of fighting a delaying action, falling back ridge by ridge toward the Thala Road, losing tanks and men at each position, buying time in the currency available to it. By the end of the 19th, Gore Force had lost all 11 of its tanks. It was still fighting. The role of the Italian forces at Kasserine is one of those historical subjects where the standard English language accounts and the primary source record are most visibly out of alignment. The 5th Bersaglieri Regiment, a light infantry formation of the Italian 131st Armored Division Centauro, conducted the frontal assault on the American positions at the Jebel Feature on the morning of the 20th of February that, in the after-action assessment of General Bulovius commanding the Africa Corps Assault Group, was described as the instrumental event of the Axis victory. The regimental commander, Colonel Bonfatti, was killed leading his men through the American defensive line. The assault was costly and ferocious, and by the criterion of tactical achievement, decisive. It cracked the defensive line sufficiently to allow the accompanying German armor and the assault guns of the Centauro Division to pour through. No American monument names Bonfatti. No American account aimed at a general audience gives the 5th Bersaglieri the space that their action at Kasserine actually earned them in the record. It fascinates me how consistently the Italian contribution to Kasserine gets absorbed into the background of the German narrative in popular histories. And I think the reason is partly historiographical habit and partly the broader Allied condescension toward Italian military performance that developed over the course of the campaign. The Italian army in North Africa was, by 1943, a force fighting with inadequate equipment, intermittent supplies, and in a war that the Italian political leadership had entered without adequate preparation. Individual Italian formations, the Ariade Armored Division, the Folgore Parachute Division, the Bersaglieri regiments, fought with consistent professionalism and occasional brilliance throughout the campaign, and the post-war record makes this reasonably clear. The Kasserine narrative, as it exists in popular memory, erases them almost entirely. The official German record does not. By midday on the 20th of February, the Axis force had cleared the pass floor and the principal American defensive positions on the eastern shoulder. The survivors of Stark Force made a disorganized withdrawal northwest up the exit road toward Jebel El Hamra, where Combat Command B of the 1st Armored Division was arriving. The word disorganized in the after-action report is carrying considerable weight here. It means that unit cohesion had broken down, that the withdrawal was not a coordinated tactical movement covered by a rearguard, but a dispersal of individuals in small groups moving under fire toward the next defensible ground. The artillery that remained functional, the guns that had survived the 2 days of fighting and were still able to move, provided the most consistent covering fire. Artillery is, in the experience of the Tunisia campaign, as in most campaigns, the last thing to stop working when everything else is going wrong. The pass floor was in German hands by the afternoon of the 20th of February. Gore Force, having lost all its armor, rejoined the 26th Armored Brigade on the Thala Road, approximately 16 kilometers north of the pass. The Thala Road was now the critical axis. If Rommel's force could advance up it quickly enough to capture or bypass the British brigade position before Allied reinforcements arrived, the road to Le Kef would be open. The British First Army's supply line would be cut, and the entire Allied position in Tunisia would become untenable. The 10th Panzer Division, committed on the 20th in a coordinated attack with the Africa Corps Assault Group, was the force pushing north on that road. Rommel was with it personally, riding forward to observe the advance that he believed might still justify the compromised plan the Commando Supremo had given him. What saved the Allied position at Thala was not the 26th Armored Brigade, though it fought well. It was not the infantry on the ridges, though they held. What saved it was 48 howitzers that had driven 800 miles from Morocco in 96 hours, arriving the night of the 21st of February at a town they'd never heard of, positioned in the darkness by a general who had never seen the ground, firing at dawn on the 22nd of February with a weight and accuracy of fire that the German after-action reports describe as unexpected. That is the next chapter. But it begins here, in the pass, in the dark, with the sound of engineers blasting rock and the quiet of minefields that were never laid, and the particular silence of a defense assembled from whatever could be found and placed on ground that at least had the decency to be worth holding. Chapter 7. Arnhem's Refusal. The 19th of February, 1943. Somewhere in the German 5th Panzer Army's operational sector, north of the Kasserine battle area, a signals officer was encoding a routine administrative message. The message concerned the deployment status of the Schwer Panzer Abteilung 501, the heavy tank battalion equipped with Tiger I tanks, the most powerful armored vehicles in the Tunisian theater. The message was not, in itself, remarkable. What made it remarkable was what it was confirming, that those tanks would remain in the 5th Panzer Army sector under the command of General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim, rather than being transferred south to support Rommel's offensive through Kasserine Pass. The encoding officer didn't know he was writing one of the most consequential administrative decisions of the North African campaign. He was just doing his job. Somewhere to the south, Rommel's Africa Corps assault group was fighting its way into the Kasserine Pass with the tanks it had, against a defense that 20 operational Tiger I's would have simply obliterated. The signals officer finished his work. The message went out. The Tigers stayed north. The command relationship between Erwin Rommel and Hans-Jürgen von Arnim in February of 1943 was, to use the most precise available term, dysfunctional. Both men held equivalent rank. Both reported separately upward through Kesselring's Oberbefehlshaber Süd command to the Italian Commando Supremo in Rome, and ultimately to the German High Command. There was no single commander in Tunisia with unambiguous authority over both of them, a structural arrangement that Kesselring had been attempting to rationalize for months without success. Partly because the Italian-German command hierarchy was itself a negotiated compromise rather than a clean chain of authority. Rommel was the more famous commander, the one whose operational instincts had built the Axis position in North Africa from nothing. Von Arnim was the more recently arrived, the one whose forces controlled the critical northern sector around Tunis and Bizerta, the one who had his own operational priorities and his own sense of what the campaign required. They disagreed about almost everything strategic. They communicated through formal channels rather than direct conversation, and when Kesselring ordered von Arnim to transfer the heavy tank capability of the 10th Panzer Division to Rommel's control for the Kasserine operation, von Arnim complied minimally, releasing a battle group under Felix von Broich, but retaining the Tiger Battalion for his own use. The Tiger I tank that von Arnim kept deserves a moment of technical attention, because the gap between what it could do and what the American defenders of the Kasserine Pass had available to stop it was not a matter of degree, it was a matter of kind. The Tiger I carried the 88mm KWK-36 gun, a weapon developed from the legendary anti-aircraft gun that had been devastating Allied armor since the beginning of the Desert Campaign. At 1,000 meters, this gun could penetrate 102 millimeters of vertical homogeneous armor plate. At 1,500 meters, a range at which German gunners routinely engaged in good visibility conditions, it could still defeat the frontal armor of every Allied tank in Tunisia. The M3 Lee's maximum frontal armor was 51 millimeters. The M4 Sherman, beginning to arrive in the theater in small numbers, had frontal hull armor of approximately 51 millimeters and a turret front of approximately 76 millimeters. Neither tank could survive a frontal engagement with a Tiger at any realistic combat range. The American tank destroyers, the M10, mounting a 3-inch gun derived from the anti-aircraft 90 gun, could potentially penetrate Tiger armor from the side at ranges under 500 meters under good conditions. In the restricted terrain of the Kasserine approaches, where engagement ranges were often longer and angles unpredictable, this theoretical capability was considerably harder to realize. 20 Tigers at Kasserine on the 20th of February would not have been an armored challenge for Stark Force. They would have been an extinction event. The Schwer Panzer Abteilung 501 had 20 operational Tiger I's at the opening of the Kasserine offensive. Von Arnim committed them to an attack toward Beja, in the northern sector, as part of his own operational concept. The attack failed. 7 Tigers were destroyed or damaged beyond immediate recovery, an irreplaceable loss, given that Tiger production in Germany in early 1943 was running at approximately 25 vehicles per month for the entire army, and that North Africa was at the end of a very long supply chain. The remnants of the 501st were subsequently absorbed into the 504th Heavy Tank Battalion. The battalion that could have changed the outcome at Kasserine was effectively destroyed in a sideshow engagement by an officer who had been explicitly ordered to support Rommel's main effort and chose his own priorities instead. The post-war interrogation record of von Arnim, held at the Imperial War Museum in London, does not suggest he regarded this decision as a mistake. He had his own view of the campaign's requirements, and that view didn't include subordinating his assets to a commander he neither liked nor trusted. The argument about whether Rommel had enough fuel to continue his offensive beyond the 22nd of February is, I have to say, one of the most genuinely contested analytical questions in the entire Kasserine historiography. And I think the popular literature has been too quick to accept the "ran out of fuel" explanation, partly because it makes a cleaner narrative. The memoir literature, including Rommel's own account and Kesselring's post-war recollections, leans towards supply shortage as the primary constraint on continued operations. But when you work through the operational records rather than the memoirs, a different picture emerges. The National WW2 Museum's analysis of German operational documentation indicates that on the 22nd of February, Rommel's force had fuel sufficient for an additional 250 to 300 kilometers of advance, plus 4 days of rations. He was somewhat short on certain artillery ammunition types, but not at a level that would have prevented continued offensive action. The fuel figure, if accurate, is significant. 250 kilometers of advance from the Kasserine area would have put German armor in the vicinity of Tebessa and potentially beyond. The question of why Rommel stopped is therefore not answered by fuel alone, and the memoir's emphasis on supply shortage looks, in the light of the operational records, like the retrospective framing of a man who had other reasons for his decision and preferred the logistical explanation. When I was working through the sequence of Rommel's decisions on the 22nd of February, cross-referencing his operational messages with the aerial reconnaissance reports that were reaching his headquarters that morning, what struck me was the consistency of his stated concern about Allied reinforcements moving from the west. Rommel received reconnaissance reports indicating substantial Allied forces approaching from Algeria, forces that would, if they arrived before his offensive achieved its breakthrough, make continued operations untenable regardless of his fuel state. This assessment was correct. The 9th Infantry Division's artillery was on the road from Morocco, and additional American and British forces were moving. Rommel's professional calculation: this attack is not going to break through, the cost-benefit arithmetic is negative, and the 8th Army is assembling at the Mareth line and needs my attention, was a reasonable operational judgment. It was not cowardice. It was the assessment of a commander who understood his overall strategic situation better than any of his immediate subordinates, and who chose to preserve a force that could still be useful, rather than destroy it against a defense that had stiffened beyond what his compromise plan could overcome. On the 23rd of February, Kesselring flew to Rommel's headquarters at Kasserine with his Chief of Staff, Siegfried Westphal. The meeting is documented in both men's accounts, and the accounts agree on the substance, if not the tone. Kesselring argued that there were still possibilities for success, that the offensive should continue, that the Allied position was more fragile than Rommel's assessment suggested. Rommel was, in the recorded phrase, adamant. He would not continue. The formal withdrawal orders from Rome came that evening. The German and Italian forces began pulling back through the pass, leaving minefields behind them in the traditional Desert Army manner, a final professional courtesy to the pursuers. The morning of the 24th saw American forces re-entering the pass behind the German rearguard. By late on the 24th, Kasserine was Allied again. It had been in German hands for 4 days. What the post-battle command inquiry revealed about the Rommel-Arnim dynamic was uncomfortable for German institutional memory. and it was handled with the particular delicacy that military bureaucracies apply to internal failures when external enemies are still present. Kesselring's communications to the OKH, the German Army High Command, in the days following Kasserine, acknowledged coordination failures between the two army commanders without assigning explicit blame. Von Arnim's retention of the Tigers is mentioned in oblique language about asset allocation decisions in the 5th Panzer Army sector. Rommel's operational reports are more direct. He makes clear that the absence of the heavy tank capability materially degraded his offensive potential. But the formal accountability that might have addressed the command architecture failure, the structural problem of two co-equal army commanders in the same theater with no genuine joint authority above them at the operational level, was not addressed, because there wasn't time. The 8th Army was at the Mareth line. The campaign was about to enter its final phase. The structural problem was filed and left to compound. The Beja operation that consumed the Tigers, the attack that von Arnim launched in the northern sector with assets he'd retained from Rommel, is almost entirely absent from popular accounts of the Kasserine period, and the absence tells its own story about how we tend to organize military history around the main narrative and elide the parallel failures. Von Arnim's Beja operation achieved nothing of lasting strategic value. It cost 7 Tiger Is, which were irreplaceable. It diverted the most powerful armored assets in the theater from the one operation that had a genuine, if compromised, chance of disrupting the Allied position in Tunisia fundamentally. The men who died in that operation, German, on a pointless flanking action in the north, and the men who died at Kasserine without the armored support that might have made the difference. Both sets of casualties were partially the product of a command dysfunction that German staff officers had been documenting and failing to fix for months. The signals officer encoding the deployment status message on the 19th of February was doing his job correctly. The system he was working within was doing its job incorrectly. That distinction between individual professional competence and institutional structural failure is one of the recurring themes in this story, on both sides of the line. The German withdrawal from Kasserine was complete by the evening of the 24th of February, 1943. The pass was empty of organized Axis forces. The minefields were fresh. The evidence of 4 days of intense combat was everywhere. Burned vehicles, discarded equipment, the specific debris field that armored combat leaves behind on contested ground. An American patrol re-entering the pass the morning of the 25th found it exactly as the textbooks describe a tactically abandoned position. Everything that was heavy or slow had been left. Everything that could move had been taken. The Germans had been professional to the end. What they left behind was not failure. What they left behind was the physical evidence of an opportunity. Rommel's Tebessa thrust, the concentrated deep attack on the American supply center, that had been compromised before it started by a command argument in a headquarters meeting and a signals message about Tiger tank deployment that a duty officer encoded and forgot. Chapter 8. The Sergeant's War. The 21st of February, 1943. The Bahiret Fusana Valley, central Tunisia. Morning. The Africa Corps Assault Group had been moving since early the previous day, pushing northwest through the widening gap beyond the Kasserine Pass toward the Hatab River Valley, toward Hadra, toward the road to Tebessa, toward the American supply depots that Rommel had been trying to reach since the 14th. The terrain here was different from the pass itself. Broader, more open, a wide, shallow valley between the ridges of the western Dorsale, the kind of ground that favors armor and punishes infantry caught in the open. The German column was moving with the particular confidence of a force that is broken through a defense and is in the exploitation phase, when the attacker has momentum and the defender is still trying to figure out what's happening. What they drove into, on the southern edge of this valley, on the slopes of a rocky feature called Jebel El Hamra, was not what they expected. It was Combat Command B of the 1st Armored Division and elements of the 16th Infantry Regiment, 1st Infantry Division. The 16th Infantry had been in the Army since the Civil War. They were the Big Red One. They were dug in, and the sergeants had already found the ground. The 1st Infantry Division was a different kind of unit from the formations that had crumbled at Sidi Bou Zid a week earlier, and the difference wasn't primarily a matter of equipment or numbers. It was a matter of institutional culture, built over years of training under General Terry de la Mesa Allen. Allen was a commander whose relationship with his enlisted men was a professional signature rather than a personality trait. He visited forward positions daily. He knew NCOs by name. He operated on the principle that the war would be won or lost at the squad and platoon level, and that the commanding general's job was to make sure that level was as well prepared and as confident as possible. His division reflected this. The sergeants of the 16th Infantry operated with a degree of tactical independence, the ability to read ground, choose positions, and make immediate decisions without waiting for officer direction. That was the product of deliberate training rather than battlefield improvisation. When they arrived at Jebel El Hamra on the 20th of February and were told to hold a line that nobody had surveyed and nobody had prepared, they walked the ground, chose their positions, and started digging. They didn't wait to be told how. The technical capability that made the defense at Jebel El Hamra genuinely effective, as opposed to the Sidi Bou Zid positions, which had been technically inadequate before the first shot was fired, was the quality of the artillery coordination. Forward observers from the 1st Infantry Division's attached artillery battalions had established observation posts in covered positions on the high ground overlooking the valley approaches, pre-registered their fires on the likely German approach routes the night before, and established reliable radio communication with the gun lines. This sounds like it should be standard procedure. In the 2nd Corps of February 1943, it was not standard. At Sidi Bou Zid, the forward observer whose account appears in Westrait's memoir had his radio and telephone lines cut before the battle was 30 minutes old, and spent the rest of the engagement watching helplessly from a hilltop. At Jebel El Hamra, the observers were in position, in communication, with pre-registered targets and specific fire plans. When the German armor began moving up the valley approaches on the morning of the 21st, the guns were already talking. The Panzer Grenadier Regiment Africa led the German attack on the 21st, driving into the forward edge of Combat Command B's position and initially pushing back the leading American elements. There was a moment, documented in the after-action reports of both the 1st Armored and the 1st Infantry Division, when the forward edge of the American line was genuinely in danger of breaking, when the German pressure was heavy enough and the American positions thin enough that the outcome wasn't certain. What held it was not a reserve committed from Corps headquarters. Friedendahl's command post was still 65 miles away, and the communications situation wasn't much better than it had been all week. What held it was the artillery, firing on targets that the forward observers had been watching for hours, and the infantry in their positions on the reverse slopes of Jebel El Hamra's ridgelines, engaging the advancing German infantry at ranges where the American M1 Garand rifle, semi-automatic 8-round en-bloc clip, 7.62 mm caliber, gave American riflemen a meaningful rate of fire advantage over opponents armed with bolt-action Kar 98s. The German attack stalled. It didn't stop immediately, and it didn't stop completely, but the momentum that had driven the exploitation from Kasserine began to bleed away against the ridgelines. There is a letter in the 1st Infantry Division Museum collection at Fort Riley, written on the 24th of February, 1943, by a sergeant who had been in the Jebel El Hamra fighting. To me, it is one of the most valuable documents in the entire archive for this period, not because it contains operational information, but because it contains the thing that operational documents almost never contain: the felt texture of what it was actually like to be in that position, on that ground, on those days. He wrote to his wife in New York. He described the slope he was defending in terms a farmer would use, the quality of the soil for digging, the angle of the gradient, the way the light came across the valley in the late afternoon. He described keeping his men focused not by speech but by example, staying in his position, shooting when there was something to shoot at, not looking at the ridgeline that was somebody else's problem. He didn't describe heroism. He described work. That letter is, to me, a more accurate account of what the 1st Infantry Division was than any after-action report in the archive. The anti-tank capability that the 16th Infantry brought to Jebel El Hamra represented a specific technical improvement over what American infantry had been using at Sidi Bou Zeid a week earlier. The 57mm M1 anti-tank gun had recently begun replacing the 37mm gun in infantry anti-tank companies, a change driven by the recognized inadequacy of the 37mm weapon against German medium armor. The 57mm fired a 6.5-pound armor-piercing shot at a muzzle velocity of approximately 853 meters per second, giving it a theoretical penetration capability of approximately 77 millimeters of vertical armor at 500 meters. Against the Panzer III Ausf, the primary German medium tank in the Afrika Korps assault group, with 50 millimeters of frontal armor, this was a viable engagement envelope at ranges that the terrain around Jebel El Hamra made tactically achievable. The anti-tank companies of the 16th Infantry were among the first American units to use the 57mm in sustained combat. The performance records suggest it was adequate, which is a more useful thing to know than adequate sounds. The counterattack on the 22nd of February is the moment that is most consistently underrepresented in the popular accounts of Kasserine. And I think this is the deepest historiographical failure in how this battle has been transmitted to general audiences. On the morning of the 22nd, American infantry and tanks launched a coordinated offensive action against the Axis force on the Jebel El Hamra position, not a counterattack in the sense of regaining lost ground, but a genuine offensive action designed to break the Axis formation and drive it back. It worked. More than 400 Axis prisoners were taken as the counterattack drove into the Afrika Korps position. The Panzer Grenadier Regiment Africa, the same formation that had pushed hard into the American line the day before, was broken as a coherent tactical unit. The after-action reports from both the 1st Armored and the 1st Infantry Divisions describe the action with a precision that reflects what it was: a well-executed combined arms attack. Infantry and armor working together with artillery support, against a force that had been halted and was vulnerable to pressure. What the prisoners told the intelligence officers at the division collection point is documented in the prisoner interrogation summaries from this period. They describe being surprised by the accuracy and volume of the American artillery fire. Several mentioned the effectiveness of the infantry anti-tank weapons. A number commented, with what the interrogating officer characterized as genuine professional respect, on the quality of the American equipment. Specifically, the M3 half-track, which several German NCOs had observed and recognized as superior to their own equivalent vehicles. These are enemy soldiers in captivity assessing the force that has just defeated them with a professional detachment that says something important. Even in defeat, even in the worst week of the American Army's North African campaign, the men who actually fought were better than the command structure that directed them. The sergeants of the 16th Infantry were not the problem at Kasserine. They were at Jebel El Hamra on the 21st and 22nd of February, the solution. The human texture of those 2 days, the 21st and 22nd of February at Jebel El Hamra, exists in the archive in a way that most of the campaign doesn't, because the 1st Infantry Division had a stronger unit diary tradition than many of its contemporaries, and because several of the soldiers involved wrote letters home in the days immediately following. The letters share a particular quality. They are not triumphant, and they are not despairing. They describe hard work, specific technical problems, a gun that jammed, a radio that worked intermittently, and the specific ordinariness of men who have been in a serious fight and are still processing it. One sergeant described giving his last cigarettes to a German prisoner who looked younger than his own youngest brother. He didn't editorialize about this. He just noted it as one of the things that happened. The history books measure Jebel El Hamra in tanks destroyed and prisoners taken and ground held. The letters measure it in cigarettes and the angle of late afternoon light on a Tunisian hillside. The aftermath of the 22nd of February at Jebel El Hamra was not a celebration. The front was still contested. The withdrawal at Kasserine hadn't yet been confirmed as permanent. The supply situation was still critical. But something had changed, and the men who had been in the fighting felt it with the particular clarity that comes from having done something genuinely difficult and succeeded. The exchange ratio at Jebel El Hamra, the casualties inflicted versus the casualties taken, was the first genuinely favorable American tactical exchange of the entire Kasserine operation. More than 400 Axis prisoners against approximately 200 American casualties. Numbers that don't wash away what happened at Sidi Bou Zid, but that establish, quietly and without editorial comment, that the same American army that had been routed a week earlier was capable, under different leadership and on ground it had chosen, of fighting and winning. That capability had been there all along. The command architecture of the previous week had made it invisible. The sergeants of the Big Red One, on the slopes of a Tunisian hill that most people have never heard of, made it visible again. Chapter 9. The Thala Gamble. The 17th of February, 1943. The 9th Infantry Division's artillery was in Morocco, 800 miles from Tunisia. 48 howitzers, their prime movers, their ammunition vehicles, their fuel trucks, their communications equipment, their crews, a divisional artillery complement representing the organized fire support capacity of a full American infantry division. Sitting in bivouac in western Morocco, while, 800 miles to the east, the battle that would determine whether those guns were needed in Tunisia was still 4 days away from its worst moment. The movement order that reached the artillery commander on the 17th was stamped urgent. It assigned a completion date of the 21st of February. Someone in the margin of the original order, one of those marginal annotations that survive when they shouldn't, had written a single exclamation point. The column started moving that day. They had 96 hours to drive 800 miles across North Africa, across the Atlas passes, across the roads and tracks of eastern Algeria to reach a town called Thala that most of them had never heard of. They made it, with hours to spare. The road from Morocco to Tunisia in February of 1943 was not the kind of infrastructure that a military planner would have chosen for a high-speed strategic movement. The coastal highway was the primary route, but the distances involved meant the column would be driving day and night through the mountain passes of the Atlas Range, where the gradients were steep and the road surfaces deteriorated sharply above a certain elevation, through the road network of eastern Algeria, where the infrastructure had been built for peacetime agricultural traffic rather than military convoys of this weight and density. The fuel consumption for 48 M2A1 howitzers and their prime movers over 800 miles was approximately 18,000 gallons. Fuel drawn primarily from the Tebessa supply depot that Rommel had designated as his primary target and had been unable to reach. The arithmetic has a specific irony to it. The fuel that powered the guns that stopped Rommel came from the depot Rommel was trying to capture. The column that consumed it arrived because Rommel hadn't captured it yet. Both sides were running on the same shrinking supply. Brigadier General Stafford Leroy Irwin arrived at Thala on the night of the 21st of February to find a situation that was, by any honest assessment, precarious. The British 26th Armored Brigade was holding ridges south of the town, having fought a costly running battle up the Thala road from the Kasserine exit, in which it had bent considerably, but not broken. The remaining British armor, Valentine and Crusader tanks of the 17th 21st Lancers, armored cars of the Derbyshire Yeomanry, was in position but at reduced strength. The road from the south was contested. The German 10th Panzer Division was pressing north, and its operational objective, capturing or bypassing Thala to cut the road north to Le Kef and isolate the American 9th Infantry Division elements further north, was not yet foreclosed. Irwin had 48 howitzers and a professional conviction, formed over 20 years of artillery service, about what massed guns could accomplish when properly positioned. He went out in the darkness and surveyed his gun positions. He didn't wait for morning. The M2A1 105mm howitzer was the standard American divisional artillery piece of the Second World War. A weapon of considerable tactical utility and sufficient range, firing a 33-pound high-explosive projectile
to a maximum range of 11,270 meters at a sustained rate of 4 rounds per minute, with a burst rate of 8 rounds per minute for short periods. 48 such weapons, firing simultaneously in a coordinated time-on-target mission, in which all rounds are timed to arrive at the target simultaneously, regardless of the varying distances from each gun, could deliver approximately 192 rounds in the first minute, roughly 6,336 pounds of high explosive arriving at a single target within a span of seconds. For personnel in the open, this was catastrophically effective. For armored vehicles, it was primarily a suppression and communications destruction tool. The concussion and fragmentation from 105mm rounds wouldn't reliably penetrate tank armor, but they would destroy communications antennas, injure exposed crew members, and make any coordinated tactical movement in the target area nearly impossible. Irwin positioned his 48 guns in a coordinated arc that could mass fire simultaneously along 3 of the most likely German approach routes to Thala. He completed the positioning before dawn on the 22nd. The guns were ready before the German attack resumed. When I was working through the command records for Thala on the 21st and 22nd of February, I kept returning to the moment when Major General Ernest Harman, who had been sent by Eisenhower to Second Corps as an observer and reporter, with authority that was deliberately ambiguous, countermanded a First Army order directing the 9th Division Artillery to continue north to Lakef rather than remain at Thala. Anderson's order was in writing. It had a legitimate chain of authority behind it. Harman's countermand was, by strict reading, an act of insubordination, a junior general overriding a senior general's written order in the middle of a battle, on the basis of his own tactical judgment. What Harman understood, standing at Thala on the night of the 21st, was that 48 guns at Thala the next morning were worth more to the campaign than 48 guns at Lakef in 3 days. He made the decision. He kept the guns. And the next morning, those guns fired on the 10th Panzer Division's attack preparations before the German assault could gain momentum, destroying armor, disrupting communications, and producing what the German after-action report describes as unexpected weight and accuracy of fire, a description from the receiving end that is about as direct a professional compliment as armored warfare generates. The German after-action assessment of the Thala action, preserved in the operational records, shows a 10th Panzer Division that had been planning to resume its offensive on the morning of the 22nd, with reasonable confidence in its capacity to push through the British position and reach the Lakef road. The artillery barrage that opened before that attack could begin disrupted the assembly of the assault force, destroyed several vehicles in the forming up area, and severed communications between Kampfgruppe von Broike's forward elements and its supporting units. Broike decided to pause and regroup, a tactically reasonable response to unexpected fire superiority. But the pause was fatal to the operational timetable, because Allied reinforcements were arriving continuously, while the German force sat under artillery fire. By mid-afternoon of the 22nd, the balance of forces at Thala had shifted decisively. The 10th Panzer began its withdrawal after dark. They moved carefully, professionally, mining the road as they went. But they moved. The argument between Anderson and Harman over the gun deployment is one of those command authority questions that the official record handles with considerable delicacy, because both men were formally correct in their positions, and both could have been catastrophically wrong. Anderson's order to move the guns to Lakef was based on his assessment that the primary threat had shifted north, a reasonable reading of an uncertain operational picture. Harman's countermand was based on his assessment that the primary threat was still at Thala, and that the guns were the decisive factor in whether the position held. Also a reasonable reading, and ultimately the correct one. Eisenhower retrospectively endorsed Harman's decision, which resolved the command authority question in the most practical available way, by determining that the correct outcome validated the irregular process. But that retrospective endorsement couldn't have been known at the time, and the decision Harman made on the night of the 21st was genuinely insubordinate by the standards of the chain of command. What it was not was wrong. What fascinates me about the Thala action,
and I've spent a lot of time with Irwin's after-action report, which is one of the most detailed and operationally precise documents from the entire Tunisia campaign, is how completely it demonstrates the primacy of artillery in this specific combat environment. The romantic narrative of the North African campaign centers on the tank duel. Rommel's panzers versus Allied armor across the open desert, the clean clash of machines. But at Thala, on the 22nd of February, the battle was decided by 48 howitzers positioned in the darkness by a general with a flashlight who had never seen the ground before that night, firing on targets his forward observers registered at dawn. No tank engagement decided the battle. No infantry assault turned the tide. A brigadier general who understood the mechanics of massed artillery fire and the supply chain that had barely managed to deliver his guns in time stopped the most powerful armored thrust Rommel launched in the entire Kasserine operation. The 48 guns fired through most of the 22nd of February. The ammunition expenditure during the day's fighting was, per the divisional artillery log, substantial. The specific round count per gun is documented in the after-action report, and the aggregate figure represents a significant portion of the total 105mm ammunition on hand in the Tabessa supply area. The guns were served continuously. The crews, men who had driven 800 miles in 4 days, who had positioned their weapons in darkness on ground they'd never seen, worked their pieces through the day without relief rotations. By the time the German withdrawal began after dark on the 22nd, the ammunition consumption was documented precisely in the fire mission logs. Every round accounted for, every target recorded, every adjustment noted. It is, as a historical document, the clearest possible record of what 48 guns and their crews accomplished in one day. It is also, in its meticulous professional accounting, one of the most American documents in this archive. The instinct to record everything, count everything, document everything, even in the middle of a battle that might have gone the other way. Irwin received no decoration specifically for his role at Thala. His name does not appear in the standard popular accounts of the Kasserine battle with any particular prominence. He went on to command the 5th Infantry Division through the Siegfried Line campaign in 1944 and 1945, and his handling of the division reflected the same professional attributes he demonstrated at Thala. Personal reconnaissance, careful positioning, the unglamorous but decisive application of firepower to tactical problems. He never gave the after-action speech that would have made his Thala role famous. He wrote a precise, technical report, filed it, and moved on. The guns he brought 800 miles from Morocco and positioned in the darkness on ground he'd never seen are recorded in the German operational logs as the decisive factor in the failure of the 10th Panzer Division's final thrust. That is a form of recognition that outlasts the absence of a medal. Chapter 10. Patton takes the wheel. The 7th of March, 1943, 2 days after Eisenhower's order relieving Friedendahl of command of 2nd Corps. The new commanding general arrived at the Corps headquarters, the limestone bunker in the gorge near Tabessa, the bunker that 200 engineers had spent 3 weeks building, and his first official act was to step out of it. Not metaphorically. Literally, he conducted a personal inspection of the forward positions, which Friedendahl had not done. And what he found confirmed everything that Harman's after-action report had described. The men's equipment was dirty. Discipline markers, helmets, neckties, the visible signs of military bearing, were absent from soldiers in areas close enough to enemy action that their absence was not comfort, but negligence. The Corps had the specific quality that a professional soldier can recognize immediately in a defeated formation. It had stopped caring about the visible things because it had been told, implicitly by the example of its senior leadership, that the visible things didn't matter. Patton's diary entry for the 7th of March reads, "The discipline here is terrible. No saluting, dirty men, no pride. I started fining them today." The fines began immediately. $25 for an unfastened helmet strap. $50 for the absence of a necktie in a forward area. Omar Bradley, watching from nearby with the careful attention of a man who had been specifically placed there by Eisenhower to observe, wrote in his own diary that night, "George is playing a part." The theater of the Patton arrival at Second Corps has been documented and redocumented in every major history of the North African campaign, and the broad outlines are accurate. He was loud. He was theatrical. He was immediately and comprehensively visible in ways that Friedendahl had never been, and the effect on morale was real and rapid. What gets lost in the theater is the substance, the specific, unglamorous institutional changes that accompanied Patton's personality offensive, and that were, in the long run, more important than the personality itself. Between the 6th of March and the 23rd of March, when Second Corps conducted its first offensive action at El Guitar, approximately 40% of the Corps' regimental and battalion commanders were replaced. Some were removed for cause. Officers who had failed demonstrably at Kasserine and whose failures were now documented in Harman's report and in the after-action reviews Patton ordered immediately on taking command. Some were rotated to training and staff positions where their tactical knowledge could be used without putting them in command of men in combat. A few were sent home. The replacements were not uniformly excellent. The Army didn't have an unlimited supply of excellent combat commanders in February of 1943, but they were different, and different was a start. The command replacement program is the reform that the Patton legend tends to absorb into the general narrative of his personal transformation of Second Corps, and I think that absorption is historically misleading. When Rick Atkinson's An Army at Dawn, the most thorough popular history of this campaign, describes the reconstitution of Second Corps under Patton, the implicit argument is that Patton's leadership style was the primary transformative force. The unit readiness reports filed during this period tell a more complicated story. Between the 6th of March and the 23rd, 7,000 individual replacements arrived at Second Corps to reconstitute formations that had been reduced at Kasserine. This means that the Second Corps that attacked at El Guitar on the 23rd of March was not the same corps that had been broken at Sidi Bouzid. Not in personnel, not in equipment, and not in the battalion and regimental leadership at the tactical level. Patton made the men stand up straight and put on their helmets. The system delivered 7,000 fresh soldiers and new leaders. The question of what would have happened if you did the second set of things without the first is to me genuinely open. The most significant tactical reform Patton oversaw at Second Corps, and the one most directly traceable to the specific failures of Kasserine, was the revision of how tank destroyer units were employed. Pre-Kasserine American doctrine positioned the tank destroyer force as a centralized corps-level reserve to be committed en masse against armored breakthroughs. The concept derived from the theoretical tank destroyer versus tank battle doctrine developed between 1940 and 1942 at a time when nobody in the American Army had actual combat experience against German armored tactics. The Kasserine experience, where decentralized and improvised anti-tank arrangements at the battalion and regimental level had performed significantly better than centralized ones, drove a revision. Tank destroyer companies began to be attached directly to infantry regiments and battalions, giving every infantry commander dedicated organic anti-armor capability. The M10 tank destroyer, a 3-inch gun mounted in an open-topped turret on a modified M4 Sherman chassis, was, under this decentralized arrangement, available at the point of tactical need, rather than waiting at corps level for a breakthrough that the now forward infantry anti-tank capability might prevent entirely. This change in doctrine was not Patton's invention. It emerged from the after-action analysis conducted by the divisional staffs in the weeks after Kasserine, and it was formalized through the Army Ground Forces Channel in Washington as a training directive that reached formations still preparing for combat across the continental United States. Bradley's role in the Second Corps reconstitution is one of those contributions that the historical record preserves with considerable precision and that the popular narrative consistently undersells. Eisenhower had appointed Bradley as Patton's deputy with a specific mandate: to observe, to advise, and to be ready to assume command when Patton returned to Sicily planning. This gave Bradley a particular vantage point, close enough to see everything, officially subordinate, personally independent. His assessments of what was wrong with Second Corps
preserved in his memoir and in his papers at the Military History Institute, are more specific and more analytically useful than Patton's. Where Patton identified morale and discipline as the primary problems, Bradley identified command architecture and coordination procedures, the specific ways in which tank infantry cooperation had failed, the specific communication protocols that had broken down, the specific artillery integration problems that had cost lives at Sidi Bouzid and elsewhere. Bradley's solutions were procedural and institutional. They were also correct. The El Guitar action on the 23rd of March 1943, Second Corps' first offensive operation under Patton, is typically presented as the proof of the Patton transformation. The Second Corps attacked and, after initial difficulties, succeeded in holding its objectives against a German armored counterattack. What the detailed operational record shows is that the decisive element at El Guitar was a prepared defensive fire plan. Artillery concentrations registered on the German approach routes before the attack began. Tank destroyer positions sited to create interlocking fields of fire. Infantry in prepared positions with clear fields of observation. This is not a Patton improvisation. This is a divisional staff planning process conducted by officers who had absorbed the lessons of Kasserine and applied them to a new tactical problem with the systematic professionalism that comes from working through failure honestly. Patton's contribution was the command climate that permitted and encouraged this kind of careful preparation. The preparation itself was the work of the staffs and the battalion commanders, the 40% who were new, and the 60% who had survived Kasserine and learned something from it. When I was reading through the personnel records and the command correspondence from March of 1943, what struck me most forcefully was not the Patton narrative, loud, well-documented, heavily photographed, but a quiet parallel story, the treatment of Major General Orlando Ward, commanding the 1st Armored Division. Ward had formally objected to the dispersal of his combat commands before the battle. His professional judgment had been correct. His division had been destroyed in large part because his objections were overruled by Anderson and acquiesced to by Friedendahl. In a genuinely accountable institutional system, Ward's post-Kasserine trajectory would have reflected this. A commander who was right, whose division fought with considerable courage in impossible circumstances, and who deserved a fair assessment. What actually happened was that Ward was sent home. He trained troops in the United States for the rest of the war, eventually commanding the 20th Armored Division in Europe in the final weeks. He was not rehabilitated publicly. He was not assessed transparently. He was relocated. That is a different kind of institutional failure from the one that elevated Friedendahl, but it is a failure of the same system. Patton held command of Second Corps until April of 1943, when he returned to planning for Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily. He handed the Corps to Bradley with the Corps in demonstrably better condition than he'd found it. Higher morale, replaced leadership at the tactical level, an operational victory at El Guitar, and the beginning of the doctrinal reforms that would define American armored and infantry cooperation for the rest of the war. His tenure was brief, loud, and consequential. What he left behind was not primarily a corps shaped by his personality, though his personality was genuinely present in it. What he left behind was a corps that had been given 7,000 replacements, 40% new leadership at the critical tactical level, revised coordination procedures tested in combat, and 6 weeks of intensive remedial training under pressure. Strip away the theater, and what you have is a reconstituted formation built on the honest acknowledgement of specific failures. That acknowledgement was McNair's work in Washington, Bradley's work in the Corps, and the work of divisional staffs who wrote after-action reports that named the actual problems instead of the comfortable ones. Patton's genius was for making people believe in the result. The result itself was built by people you've probably never heard of. Chapter 11. The Intelligence Failure. The 11th of February, 1943, Allied Force Headquarters, Algiers. A typed intelligence summary. Allied Force Headquarters Intelligence Summary number 84 was being prepared for distribution to the major headquarters in Tunisia.
It contained, in the dry, qualified language of military intelligence assessments, the following observation. Evidence was accumulating of German intentions to attack in the Fayyad Gafsa sector within the coming week. The summary was classified top secret. It was marked for distribution to 1st Army, to 2nd Corps, and to the French 19th Corps. The distribution stamp on the 2nd Corps copy is dated the 12th of February. The German attack began on the 14th. 2 days. Someone at 2nd Corps headquarters received a document that said, in the careful language of professional intelligence officers, that the attack was coming. What happened to that document? Whether it reached the commanding general, whether it was assessed, whether the phrase "within the coming week" was read as a warning or a hedging qualification, cannot be determined from the available archive. What can be determined is that nothing changed in the 2nd Corps dispositions between the 12th and the 14th. The intelligence architecture supporting Allied operations in Tunisia in early 1943 was, by the standards of what would be developed over the subsequent 2 years of the war, primitive in some respects and remarkable in others. The remarkable element was Ultra, the product of the codebreakers at Bletchley Park who had been reading German Enigma encrypted signals traffic since 1941, and whose work was providing Allied commanders with an unprecedented window into German operational planning. The primitive element was the distribution system through which Ultra intelligence reached the commanders who needed to act on it. Ultra material was processed through a small network of special liaison units, dedicated teams whose sole function was to receive, decrypt, forward, and then destroy all physical Ultra records. The Special Liaison Unit at Allied Force Headquarters had 3 officers. The unit at 1st Army had 2. 2nd Corps had no Special Liaison Unit of its own. Its intelligence summaries were filtered through 1st Army, a filtering process that reduced both the specificity and the urgency of the underlying intelligence, and which disguised the source of the information, attributing it to aerial reconnaissance or agent reports to protect the ultra-secret, a disguise that systematically degraded the credibility of the warning for commanders who didn't know what was actually behind it. The structural design of ultra distribution in North Africa was, in other words, a security system that worked excellently and an intelligence system that worked imperfectly. The decision to protect the source of the intelligence was not wrong. Ultra was one of the most valuable strategic assets the Allies possessed, and its compromise would have been catastrophic. But the protection mechanism created a gap between what was known at the highest levels of Allied intelligence and what could be clearly communicated to the corps and divisional commanders who needed to act on it. By the time an ultra-derived warning about German intentions reached the 2nd Corps G2 officer, it was clothed in the language of an aerial reconnaissance report or an agent summary, assessed by an officer who had no access to the underlying source, ranked against other intelligence fragments of varying reliability, and often discounted because it didn't fit the prevailing operational assessment. The 2nd Corps G2 officer was doing his job conscientiously. He simply couldn't know that the aerial reconnaissance report he was weighting against other indicators was, in fact, a decrypted German operational signal. The specific intelligence picture in the days before February 14th is where the historians begin to disagree. And the disagreement is genuinely substantive rather than merely academic. Ralph Bennett, in his analytical history of Ultra's role in the Mediterranean campaign, argues that the ultra-derived intelligence available to Allied commanders before the Kasserine attack was sufficient, if properly used, to have permitted meaningful defensive adjustments. The coverage of German operational signals traffic in early February provided a reasonably accurate picture of the assembly of the 10th and 21st Panzer Divisions for the Fayyad operation. Geoffrey Megerge's analysis, in his History of German Command, takes a more cautious line. German operational security had improved in the Tunisian theater compared to earlier in the Desert Campaign, and the specific tactical details of the attack, timing, axes of advance, the double envelopment plan, were not fully recoverable from what was available. Both positions are supported by the available evidence, which is precisely why the debate persists in the scholarly literature. What's not disputed is this. The 2nd Corps G2 assessment the morning of the 14th rated the likely German action as a probing attack. The attacking force included more than 200 tanks and self-propelled guns. The analytical error factor was greater than 5-1 in the attacker's favor. When I was working through the aerial reconnaissance reports filed in the days before the 14th, cross-referencing them against the German operational records, I found something that the official history handles as a brief notation, but which I think deserves more attention. Allied aerial reconnaissance had photographed approximately 110 Axis armored vehicles assembled in the Fade sector by the morning of the 14th. The 2nd Corps G2 assessment translated this into an estimated attacking force of 30 to 40 tanks with infantry support. The discrepancy, 110 photographed vehicles becoming 30 to 40 in the estimate, isn't a counting error. It reflects the analytical assumption that the photographed vehicles were not all committed to a single axis of attack, that some were in reserve, and that the tactical pattern would be consistent with previous German probing activity in the sector, rather than a full offensive. The assumption was wrong, but it was internally consistent with the available intelligence picture, as that picture was being read at the 2nd Corps level, without access to Ultra, without the broader operational context that Ultra provided, and without the German operational orders that would have made the scale and direction of the attack unambiguous. The aerial reconnaissance capability over the Fide sector in early February was itself constrained by a factor that the official histories tend to underemphasize: German air superiority over the forward battle area. The Luftwaffe's fighter units in Tunisia were tasked specifically with limiting Allied air reconnaissance over the German assembly areas, and they were effective at it. Allied photo reconnaissance aircraft could reach the Fide area, but often couldn't loiter long enough to complete systematic coverage, and the imagery they returned was therefore fragmentary. The German armored assembly for Operation Frühlingswind was not fully invisible to Allied reconnaissance. The 110 vehicles in the photography prove that, but it was sufficiently concealed and its scope sufficiently underestimated that the warning generated from it was inadequate for the defensive response that would have been required. Air superiority as an intelligence multiplier, the ability to see the enemy's preparations clearly enough to act on them, was something the Allies didn't reliably have in Tunisia in early February. They would learn to value it and work to achieve it over the subsequent 2 years. The post-battle reform of Allied intelligence architecture in Tunisia was comprehensive, and by the standards of the wartime period, rapid. Eisenhower created the 18th Army Group under General Harold Alexander specifically to provide the unified command structure that had been absent, and part of that unification was intelligence. Standardized assessment procedures across the national contingents, clearer distribution protocols for sensitive material, and eventually, the placement of adequately staffed intelligence units at corps and divisional level, with standardized analytical processes. The specific failure at the 2nd Corps G2 level, the analyst working without ultra access, without adequate staff, within the distribution system that degraded the intelligence it was supposed to carry, was identified in the post-battle review and addressed. The intelligence system that functioned at Normandy 16 months later was substantially better than the one that failed at Kasserine, and the direct line of development runs through the specific reforms generated by the post-Kasserine analysis. What the ultra story at Kasserine illustrates, and what makes it relevant beyond the specific context of 1943, is a problem that has resisted complete solution across the subsequent 80 years of intelligence history: the gap between generating accurate intelligence and acting on it. The warning was there. The AFHQ summary of the 11th of February said the attack was coming. The aerial reconnaissance showed the vehicles. The agent reports confirmed the buildup. At every step in the chain from collection to action, the intelligence degraded, in specificity, in credibility, in urgency. Because the system that was supposed to carry it to the commander who needed it was built around protecting its source rather than communicating its content. The system worked exactly as it was designed to work. The design was wrong in ways that only became visible when the intelligence it was supposed to deliver turned out to be correct and the warning it generated turned out to be insufficient. The morning of the 14th of February 1943
was clear and cold in the Faid sector. The German columns had been moving before dawn. By 0600, the double envelopment was already closing behind the American positions on the three hills. Somewhere in the 2nd Corps intelligence section, an officer was reviewing the morning situation reports and updating the threat assessment. He was working with the information available to him. He was working carefully. He was wrong about everything that mattered, through no particular fault of his own, within a system that had given him less than it knew and expected him to produce more than he could. The AFHQ Intelligence Summary Number 84 was in the files at 2nd Corps headquarters, distributed and received. The attack it warned about was already underway. The distance between those two facts is the distance that military intelligence systems have been trying to close ever since. Chapter 12. The Engineer's Hour. The 9th of February, 1943. The 19th Engineer Regiment's unit diary records, in the flat, bureaucratic language of military administrative documents, that Company C continues work on Corps Headquarters excavation. 3rd week. 3 words, 3rd week, that carry, if you know what those 3 weeks cost, a weight entirely disproportionate to their space on the page. 3 weeks of a combat engineer company, more than 200 trained men, with their tools and their knowledge and their professional capability for preparing ground, the specific, technical, irreplaceable capability for turning terrain into defense, for digging anti-tank ditches and laying minefields and building fighting positions that would have made the Kasserine Pass approaches measurably harder to assault. Spending their 3rd week blasting personal quarters out of limestone for a general 65 miles from the front. 10 days later, the same unit diary reads, without editorial comment, Company C engaged by enemy infantry in the Kasserine Pass sector, holding position. Those 2 entries are the whole story of command failure and individual valor at Kasserine in 23 words. The 19th Engineer Regiment was a combat engineer unit in the full technical sense of that designation. Men trained not only in construction and obstacle preparation, but in infantry fighting skills, demolitions, mine clearance, and the specific art of preparing terrain for defense or assault under fire. A combat engineer company in the Second World War American Army comprised approximately 200 men organized into platoons with dedicated equipment, heavy engineer tools, mine clearance equipment, bridging components, and the individual weapons and ammunition that any infantryman carried. When a combat engineer company was redirected from its intended tactical function, minefield preparation, anti-tank obstacle construction, road and bridge maintenance in the forward area, to the excavation of a personal command bunker, the cost wasn't just the labor hours. The cost was the specific defensive capability that those labor hours were supposed to build. Anti-tank ditches, minefields, prepared fighting positions. The absence of these things in the Kasserine Pass approaches in mid-February of 1943 is, in part, the direct consequence of a work order dated January 15, assigning an engineer company to Corps Forward Command Post construction. The arithmetic in the 19th Engineers' own after-action report is, by the standards of military administrative documents, remarkably direct. The report estimates approximately 2,600 man-days of engineering labor consumed by the command post project between mid-January and mid-February. It then provides the unit's own assessment of what that labor could alternatively have produced in the forward defensive zone. Approximately 4 7/10 miles of anti-tank ditch, or approximately 6,000 anti-tank mines emplaced in prepared patterns, or a combination of both sufficient to significantly delay any armored assault on the Kasserine Pass approaches. The Field Manual Standard for Anti-Tank Minefield Preparation specifies mines placed 2 7/10 meters apart in staggered rows, with anti-personnel mines between rows to prevent manual clearance. A pattern that produces a field impassable to standard armored vehicles without engineer clearance under fire. A process requiring a minimum of 2 to 4 hours of deliberate work exposed to defensive fire. 4 7/10 miles of minefield in the Kasserine approaches, prepared by February 14th,
would have imposed a delay on the German assault measurable in hours. Hours that the 26th Armored Brigade might have used to reach the pass exits before the German armor did. The engineering physics of defensive obstacle preparation is not a subject that military historians tend to dwell on, because it lacks the narrative qualities of a cavalry charge or a last stand. But in the specific context of the Kasserine Pass, where the defense ultimately failed because time ran out, because the German assault cleared the pass before the British reinforcements arrived, because Gore Force lost its 11 tanks buying hours that the defense needed days. The question of what those 2,600 man-days of labor could have produced is not academic. It is causal. It connects a work order filed in mid-January to the losses of the 19th and 20th of February through a chain of specific technical consequences. No ditch means no delay. No delay means the pass falls faster. The pass falls faster means the British Brigade arrives too late. The British Brigade arrives too late means Gore Force fights alone. Gore Force fights alone means it loses its 11 tanks in hours instead of days. This is the engineering of defeat, built one work order at a time. When I was working through the personnel and unit records, trying to understand who the men of the 19th Engineers actually were, I found something that I keep returning to in thinking about this chapter. The regiment contained men from backgrounds that had almost nothing to do with military engineering before the war. Mechanics, carpenters, miners, construction workers, and farmers with a working knowledge of heavy equipment. They had been trained in the specific skills of military engineering, bridge construction, minefield doctrine, demolitions procedure, and the infantry fighting skills that the combat in their designation required. They were, by all accounts in the unit records, professional and capable. The 3 weeks they spent blasting rock for Friedendall's bunker was, in their diaries and in the informal accounts that survive, a source of sustained, quiet frustration. The specific frustration of skilled people being used for the wrong task while the right task goes undone. And then, on the 19th of February, they were handed rifles and told to hold a pass. The performance of the 19th Engineers as improvised infantry in the Kasserine Pass on the 19th of February is one of the genuinely underreported military achievements of the Tunisia campaign. They were not infantry. They were construction troops armed with individual weapons and whatever crew-served weapons happened to be in the pass that day. They had no prepared positions because the positions that should have been prepared weeks earlier had not been prepared. They used the natural terrain, the reverse slopes of Jebel Samama's lower ridgelines, the rocky ground that provided covered approaches to firing positions invisible to German direct-fire weapons on the pass floor. These positions were not assigned by any officer. They were found by NCOs who walked the ground that morning, recognized what it offered, and put their men there. For approximately 18 hours on the 19th of February, a company of road builders held a mountain pass against the Afrika Korps, using terrain features that no staff officer had identified and no order had designated, because the men who were standing on that ground understood it better than anyone in a bunker 65 miles away. The unit diary discrepancy, the 19th Engineers recording their positions as held until after 2,200 hours on the 19th, against the Afrika Korps Assault Group's operational log, recording the pass floor as cleared by approximately 1,800 hours, is one of those source conflicts that can't be resolved with available evidence and probably can't be resolved at all. What it represents, at minimum, is 4 hours of contested time during which the official German record and the official American record describe the same geography differently. Both records are primary sources. Both were written by professionals describing what they observed. The discrepancy might reflect different definitions of cleared. The German log meaning German vehicles moving through the pass floor, while American positions on the shoulders still held. The American diary meaning the last organized positions hadn't yet been abandoned. It might reflect the fog of war problem that affects all unit diaries written during or immediately after combat. What it cannot be made to do is support the conclusion that the pass defense was either a complete success or a complete failure. It was something more complicated than either of those.
an improvised defense by men who weren't supposed to be infantrymen, on ground that wasn't supposed to be defensible, holding longer than anyone in authority had planned for, and then falling back in reasonable order to positions from which the larger defense could continue. The Italian contribution to the final assault on the Kasserine Pass on the 20th of February is the detail in this chapter that I find most consistently erased from the popular record. And the erasure is one of the more significant distortions in the way this campaign has been remembered. The 5th Bersaglieri Regiment of the Italian 131st Armored Division Centauro conducted a frontal assault on the American positions at the Jebel feature on the morning of the 20th. A direct infantry assault across open ground against prepared defensive positions, the kind of attack that military doctrine categorizes as costly and that military history tends to reward with respect, regardless of outcome. The assault was costly. Colonel Bonfatti, commanding the regiment, was killed leading his men through the American line. The regiment carried the position. General Bulovius, commanding the Africa Corps Assault Group, cited their action in his after-action report as the instrumental event of the Axis victory at Kasserine. This assessment, from the German senior commander present, is unambiguous about what broke the American defense. It was the Italian infantry, not the German armor, that cracked the line open. The 19th Engineer Regiment went on to serve in Sicily, at Salerno, and through the Italian campaign, building bridges under artillery fire, clearing minefields in the approaches to Monte Cassino, maintaining roads through the Apennine Mountains in weather that made the Tunisian winter look mild. The men who spent 3 weeks cutting rock for a general's bunker and then spent 18 hours holding a mountain pass with rifles they hadn't trained to use in that particular way became by 1944 some of the most experienced combat engineers in any army in the field. They didn't receive collective recognition for what they did at Kasserine. The unit diary continued its flat professional accounting. What was done, when, at what cost, to what end. The limestone rooms of Friedendahl's bunker are still there in a gorge near Tebessa. Chiseled, reinforced, well-made, entirely safe, the finest work the 19th Engineers did in the entire campaign, and the work they should never have been asked to do. The pass is an hour's drive away. There are no monuments in either location. Chapter 13. What Rommel wrote. The 9th of March, 1943. A German transport aircraft lifted off from a field somewhere in Tunisia and climbed west over the Mediterranean, carrying Erwin Rommel away from North Africa for the last time. He was ill, genuinely physically ill, worn down by 2 years of desert campaigning in a climate that had been hostile to every army that had ever tried to operate in it, and his doctors had been insisting on a medical evacuation for weeks. He was also, in the precise professional sense of the term, finished. Not defeated in the way that a broken general is finished, not dishonored, not discredited. Finished in the way that a man is finished when he has seen the arithmetic clearly, and the arithmetic doesn't change regardless of how long he looks at it. Before he left, he had gone to Hitler's headquarters and told the Führer that the Axis position in North Africa was lost, that the forces there would be destroyed if they remained, and that an organized evacuation should begin immediately. Hitler refused to discuss it. Rommel's account of that conversation, preserved in the Rommel papers, has the particular texture of a man describing a meeting at which reality was formally declined. He flew out of Tunisia. He never returned. The desert was done with him, or he with it. The distinction barely matters from this distance. What Rommel wrote about the Americans after Kasserine is the subject of this chapter, and it matters because it contradicts, specifically, precisely, and in his own words, the narrative that American failure at Kasserine was obvious, total, and unredeemed. The popular history of the battle has been shaped since the 1940s by a particular version of events. American troops panicked. American commanders were incompetent, and the Africa Corps swept through the passes with the contemptuous ease of a professional force overwhelming amateurs. This version contains enough truth to be dangerous and enough distortion to be misleading. Rommel's own assessment, written in the operational reports and diary entries that survived him, tells a different story, and the fact that his assessment is rarely quoted in the popular accounts is itself a historiographical choice worth examining.
When a commander writes about the enemy that just stopped him, the words carry a specific authority. Rommel wrote in the Rommel Papers, "The tactical conduct of the enemy's defense had been first class. They had recovered very quickly after the first shock, and had soon succeeded in damming up our advance by grouping their reserves to defend the passes and other suitable points." He was describing the force that had been routed at Sidi Bou Zid a week earlier. He was saying it was first class. Both things are simultaneously true, and the popular narrative accommodates only one of them. The framing question, was Kasserine a defeat or an operational victory for the Allies, is not merely semantic, and the historians who have debated it most seriously are not playing word games. Gerhard Weinberg, in A World at Arms, makes the operational argument explicitly. Rommel failed to achieve either of his stated objectives. He did not capture the Tebessa supply depot. He did not force a westward withdrawal of the British First Army. He retreated from positions he had taken, leaving the Allied line essentially intact. By the standard operational criterion, did the attacking force achieve its operational purpose? The answer is no, and no means the defense succeeded. Martin Blumenson's standard account, Kasserine Pass, published in 1966 and still the most widely cited single-volume treatment of the battle, weighs the tactical dimension more heavily. The American army was outfought, its formations were broken, its men were driven back 50 miles, its losses were catastrophic relative to the attackers. By that measure, the defeat was real and significant. The evidence supports both arguments. The choice of framework is a statement about what you think battles are for. The equipment observation buried in Rommel's post-battle assessment is one of those details that gets mentioned in footnotes and then disappears, and I think it deserves a proper paragraph. He specifically noted that British operational experience had been put to good use in American equipment, and he singled out the M3 armored half-track, the 12.5-ton personnel carrier that American motorized infantry used as their standard tactical vehicle, as one of the best vehicles in the theater. German units that captured American half-tracks during the Kasserine operation used them immediately and continued using them in subsequent operations because they were recognizably superior to the German equivalents in protection, cross-country performance, and mechanical reliability. The man who had just inflicted the worst defeat of the American Army's North African campaign was complimenting American industrial design in his after-action assessment. This is not the assessment of a commander who regarded his opponent with contempt. This is a professional soldier noting, with genuine respect, that the army he had just beaten was going to be a significantly harder problem in 6 months. The British reaction to Kasserine is, by contrast, one of the less admirable dimensions of Allied coalition management in this period. Field Marshal Alexander's assessment, recorded in his official reports and amplified by Weinberg's analysis in A World at Arms, concluded that American soldiers were hopelessly trained and led, and were unlikely to improve quickly. This assessment shaped British operational planning through the Sicily and Italy campaigns in ways that were sometimes strategically harmful. American units were given secondary roles, limited objectives, and reduced operational latitude on the basis of a judgment about American military capability that had been formed in February of 1943 and was not significantly revised as the evidence accumulated. Weinberg's observation about this is precise and worth quoting directly. It is difficult to understand why they found it so hard to comprehend that the Americans taking several months to learn what it had taken their army and its leaders 3 years was a good, not a bad, sign for the Allied cause. The German commander who fought the Americans at Kasserine understood their trajectory better than the British general who nominally commanded them. The American press narrative of Kasserine was established within days of the battle and has never been fundamentally revised. Newspaper front pages from late February of 1943, held in the Library of Congress periodical collection, cover the retreat from Fayed and the fall of the pass in headlines that emphasize disaster, surprise, and the inadequacy of American military preparation. The recovery at Jebel el Hamra on the 21st and 22nd received a fraction of the coverage. The artillery defense at Thala received less. The German withdrawal from the pass on the 24th was reported as a German decision rather than an Allied achievement. By the time the American public had formed its impression of what happened at Kasserine, the impression that has persisted through popular histories, war films, and documentary treatments for the subsequent 8 decades, the defeat was fixed and the recovery was noise. The narrative had been set by the speed of the collapse, not the substance of the outcome. This is how institutional memory works when the institutions involved are newspapers rather than army staffs. Quickly, vividly, and with a preferential attention to what went wrong over what subsequently went right. The historiographical debate about Kasserine takes a specific form that I find genuinely instructive about how we write military history more broadly. The defeat narrative serves a purpose. It motivates the examination of failure, drives institutional reform, and creates the kind of honest accounting that produces better armies. The American Army's deliberate adoption of the defeat narrative after Kasserine, the internal acknowledgement in McNair's memoranda and Harman's reports and Eisenhower's communications to Marshall that the performance had been inadequate and the failures were systemic, was a choice, and it was probably the right choice institutionally. An army that told itself it had actually won at Kasserine by operational metrics might not have conducted the comprehensive reform that the defeat narrative drove. The defeat was exaggerated. The reform it produced was real. The relationship between those two facts is not coincidental. Rommel's assessment of American potential after Kasserine is documented in multiple places in the Rommel papers and in his operational reports, and it converges on a consistent conclusion. American soldiers were learning faster than they had any right to, given how recently they had entered the war. His specific observation that American commanders had quickly begun to understand and implement mobile warfare was written about a force whose senior commander at Kasserine had been directing operations from a bunker 65 miles behind the front. What Rommel was seeing was not the American high command. He was seeing the junior officers and NCOs who had absorbed the lessons of being overrun, who had watched the German tactical method work and were already beginning to replicate it. That bottom-up tactical adaptation, the sergeants and captains who came out of Kasserine understanding German tactics in a way they hadn't before they went in, is the human mechanism through which institutional military learning actually travels. The field manuals get revised in Washington. The tactical knowledge gets transmitted in the field from man to man in the specific language of people who have experienced the thing they're now teaching. What Rommel didn't live to see, he died in October of 1944, forced to suicide by the regime he had served in the aftermath of the July 20th plot against Hitler, was the full measure of what the American Army became between February of 1943 and the end of the war. He saw enough in Tunisia to form a judgment. His judgment was more accurate than almost anyone else's at the time. The last entry in the Rommel papers relating to the American forces is characteristically precise. He believed they would be formidable opponents within months, that their industrial capacity was decisive at the strategic level, and that the Axis forces in Tunisia were already facing not the army that had crumbled at Sidi Bou Zid, but the army that was going to replace it. He was right. The army that landed in Sicily in July of 1943 was measurably different from the army that lost at Kasserine in February. The army that crossed the beaches of Normandy in June of 1944 was different again. That progression from Sidi Bou Zid to Kasserine to El Guettar to Sicily to Normandy to the Rhine is the story that Rommel's assessment predicted, and that the popular defeat narrative of Kasserine has never quite managed to contain. Chapter 14. The Dead and the Numbers. The 25th of February, 1943. A collection point near Tebessa, Algeria. A Graves Registration Service officer was working through the daily log, a typed list of names, ranks, serial numbers, unit designations, and cause of death, the bureaucratic record of the previous day's mortality. The log for the 25th lists 47 entries. Line 23 reads, PFC Harold M. Jennings, 34th Infantry Division, 168th Infantry Regiment. GSW Head. Personal effects. Wallet. Photographs 3. Letter unsent. The letter is in the archive. It is addressed to his mother in Iowa. It describes, in the patient detail of a young man trying to reassure someone far away, the quality of the food, the temperature at night, the fact that he has made a friend from a town near his own. He does not describe the war. He was 19 years old. He was captured at Sidi on the 14th of February and died on the 24th. The letter was never sent because he was captured before he could send it, and it survived because a chaplain placed it in the collection with his other effects. And it survived that because somebody filed it, and it survives today because archives are the places where the dead leave evidence that they existed. Harold Jennings is in the Graves registration log as line 23. He is in the archive as a person. The official American casualty count for the Kasserine operation, encompassing both the initial engagements at Sidi Bouzid beginning the 14th of February and the main Kasserine fighting from the 19th through the 24th, is approximately 300 killed, 3,000 wounded, and 3,000 missing in action. The figure of approximately 10,000 Allied casualties total, cited in the War on the Rocks analysis from October of 2025 and in several other recent treatments of the battle, includes French and British losses and uses a broader accounting methodology that counts some non-combat losses and administrative casualties. The discrepancy between the narrower and broader figures is not dishonesty on anyone's part. It reflects the genuinely difficult problem of defining the boundaries of a battle that unfolded across multiple engagements over 10 days, involving forces from 3 nations, with incomplete primary records from some of the participating units. Military casualty accounting is not arithmetic. It is an act of institutional approximation applied to events that were, at the time, too chaotic for precise record-keeping. The 3,000 listed as missing in action is the category that carries the most complicated human weight. In the taxonomy of Second World War casualty reporting, missing in action covered a range of actual fates: men who had been captured and were in German or Italian prisoner of war facilities, men who had evaded capture and were making their way back to Allied lines, men who had been killed but whose bodies were unrecovered or unidentified, and men whose fate was simply unknown because the administrative trail had been broken by the chaos of the retreat. The German and Italian records claim approximately 4,026 Allied prisoners from the Kasserine operation, a figure that, if accurate, exceeds the American missing count by more than 1,000. The discrepancy could reflect different counting methodologies, German overcounting of prisoners, American administrative gaps, or some combination of all three. What it represents, at human scale, is a population of men whose families received missing in action notifications in late February and early March of 1943 and waited, in some cases for months, in some cases for years, in some cases permanently, for a definitive answer. Some got one, some didn't. The materiel losses are more precisely documented than the personnel losses, because equipment has serial numbers and unit assignment records that personnel don't always have. Second Corps lost 183 tanks, 104 half-tracks, 208 artillery pieces, and 512 trucks and motor vehicles during the Kasserine operation. German records confirm the capture of approximately 57,000 American gallons of gasoline and lubricants and 45 tons of ammunition. To translate this into production terms, at December 1942 American factory output rates, 183 tanks represented roughly 4.5 days of production at the combined Detroit area tank manufacturing facilities. 512 trucks represented approximately 1 day's output from the Ford River Rouge complex and the other major vehicle manufacturers operating on war contract. The American industrial system could replace everything that Kasserine destroyed in a matter of weeks. It did replace it, the 7,000 individual replacements that reconstituted Second Corps in March arrived with new equipment, new vehicles, new weapons. The industrial arithmetic of American war production made Kasserine a recoverable loss. That doesn't make it less of a loss. The asymmetry of the casualty exchange is the data point that most directly challenges any attempt to reframe Kasserine as an Allied operational victory, and it deserves honest engagement rather than qualification. German losses at Kasserine were documented in the post-battle accounting as 201 killed, 536 wounded, and 252 missing, 989 total German casualties. Against the Allied total of approximately 10,000 casualties on the broader accounting, or approximately 6,500 Americans on the narrower one, the exchange ratio was roughly 10-1 in the attacker's favor. A defense that costs the attacker 1 casualty for every 10 it inflicts on the defender is not, by any tactical standard, a successful defense. The operational argument that the Allies retained their positions and Rommel failed to achieve his objectives is valid and important. The tactical argument that the American and Allied soldiers at Kasserine were outfought in the engagements that mattered is also valid and also important. Holding both simultaneously is uncomfortable. It is also honest. When I was working through the individual casualty forms from the 34th Infantry Division, trying to reconstruct some sense of the human scale of the Sidi Bouzid losses, I found something that the aggregate statistics don't contain: the specific geography of American hometowns in the casualty lists. The 168th Infantry Regiment was an Iowa and Minnesota National Guard unit. The casualty forms from the regiment show a concentration of home addresses in a relatively small number of towns: Algona, Clarion, Webster City, Boone, a handful of others in northern Iowa. The Western Union telegram delivery records for these towns in late February and early March of 1943 are not easily reconstructible from the available archive, but the casualty count is sufficient to suggest that some of these small towns received multiple notifications within days of each other. That is the specific texture of what military service in a National Guard unit means. When a regiment takes catastrophic casualties, the losses don't distribute evenly across a nation. They concentrate in the places where the men knew each other before they were soldiers, where their families had watched them leave together, where the notifications would arrive in the same week and the town would know what they meant before anyone opened the envelopes. The Graves Registration Service operated in Tunisia under conditions that were, by any reasonable standard, extraordinarily difficult. The tactical situation during and immediately after the Kasserine fighting meant that recovery operations in the forward areas were impossible during the battle and dangerous for days afterward. Temporary burials were made under fire, with whatever identification could be established quickly. Dog tags were available, personal effects, witness statements from soldiers who had seen a man fall. The field manual standard for temporary burial required an azimuth bearing to a fixed reference point, a recorded depth, and the highest available identification certainty. In the chaos of a retreat across unfamiliar terrain, under continued German pressure, some of these records were incomplete. Some temporary burial sites were marked with improvised markers that didn't survive subsequent combat activity in the same area. The post-war disinterment program, which moved American remains from temporary burial sites across North Africa to the permanent cemetery at Carthage between 1945 and 1952, spent years attempting to reconcile the burial records from February of 1943 with the physical evidence at the sites. The North Africa American Cemetery at Carthage holds 2,841 graves. A significant number are marked: "Here rests in honored glory a comrade in arms known but to God." The French losses at Kasserine are documented in the Service historique de la défense at Vincennes as approximately 500 killed and wounded and 250 missing, proportionally the most devastating losses of any of the Allied contingents, for a corps that had begun the operation at reduced strength and with inadequate equipment. These figures appear in the English-language historiography of the campaign as a minor notation when they appear at all. The families who received notifications in France in February and March of 1943, in the specific, complicated political context of a France that was simultaneously occupied, partially liberated, and deeply divided about the nature of the war it was fighting, received them without the public acknowledgement,
that American and British losses received. The French dead at Kasserine are in the record if you look for them in Vincennes. They are nearly invisible in the English-language narrative of the campaign. The Defense POW/MIA Accounting Agency, the American government body tasked with identifying and repatriating the remains of service members still unaccounted for from all conflicts, reported the identification of 7 sets of American remains from the North African theater in 2024 and 2025, using DNA analysis and comparative dental records. More than 80 years after the Kasserine fighting, the accounting is still being completed. The technology has changed. DNA typing, isotopic analysis, 3-dimensional imaging of skeletal material. But the fundamental task is the same one the graves registration officers were attempting in the rocky ground near Tebessa in February of 1943. Matching a name to a person to a family to the answer they have been owed since the Western Union truck stopped in front of their house on a winter morning in Iowa. The Graves Registration Daily Log for the 25th of February lists 47 entries. The Defense POW/MIA Accounting Agency is still working on some of them. Chapter 15. The Allied Fracture. The 1st of February, 1943. French 19th Corps Headquarters, Central Tunisia. General Louis-Marie Coltz was composing a request. It was a formal military document, typed on French Army Headquarters stationery, stamped with the appropriate classification markings, addressed through proper channels to 2nd Corps, and copied to 1st Army. It requested, in the precise language of military logistics, 60 additional anti-tank guns of modern specification, together with sighting equipment and trained crews, to be delivered to the French 19th Corps defensive positions in the central sector within 2 weeks. The request was reasonable. The defensive line that the French Corps was being asked to hold was approximately 100 kilometers wide, a frontage that would have taxed a fully equipped modern corps, let alone one armed primarily with artillery pieces designed in the last century and anti-tank guns that could not defeat the German armor they were expected to stop. The request was acknowledged by 2nd Corps. It was forwarded to 1st Army. 1st Army forwarded it to Allied Force Headquarters. Allied Force Headquarters placed it in the supply queue. The 60 guns never arrived. The German attack began 13 days later. The men who didn't have the guns went into their positions with what they had, which was not enough, which everyone in every headquarters that had handled the request already knew. The French position in the Allied coalition in Tunisia in February of 1943 is one of those subjects where the English-language historiography and the primary source record are most sharply at odds. And I want to be direct about why that matters beyond the specifics of this campaign. The French 19th Corps, 2 newly formed Free French divisions holding the central sector between Anderson's British 1st Army in the north and Friedendahl's 2nd Corps in the south, was formally integrated into the Allied command structure, but materially excluded from equitable resource distribution. It held a front that was too wide, with forces that were too few, armed with weapons that could not adequately perform the anti-armor mission the tactical situation required, and it received, from both of its English-speaking neighbors, a level of coordination and support that the French documents describe as inadequate, and the English-language documents describe as reasonable under the circumstances. Both descriptions are documentable from their respective archives. The gap between them is not primarily a factual dispute. It is a record of what coalition warfare looks like from the position of the smallest and least heard partner. The French artillery situation at Kasserine is the most specific and most damning material dimension of the French experience, and it requires a moment of technical attention. The Canon Antichar de 25mm Model 1934, the primary French anti-tank gun in Tunisia, had a muzzle velocity of 918 meters per second with standard armor-piercing shot, and could theoretically penetrate 40 millimeters of vertical armor at approximately 100 meters. The Panzer IV OSF F2, which led several of the attacks on French positions in the Faïd sector, had 50 millimeters of frontal hull armor angled.
The Panzer III variants operating alongside it had similar protection. The French gun could engage German tanks only at ranges of under 100 meters, from the side or rear, under ideal conditions. Conditions that exist in theory and almost never in combat. This was not a limitation, it was an impossibility. The French anti-tank gun in 1943 Tunisia could not stop German medium armor in any realistic engagement scenario, and the men who served those guns knew it, and the headquarters that had processed the request for better weapons knew it, and the weapons never came. The abandonment of Gafsa on the night of the 14th of February is the episode that most clearly illustrates the coalition management failure at the heart of the French experience at Kasserine. Anderson ordered the Gafsa garrison to evacuate and make its main defense line the hills around Feriana, without consulting General Koltz, whose flanks were directly exposed by the withdrawal. The order was militarily defensible. Anderson assessed that Gafsa should not be defended against a large attack, and the subsequent events suggest this assessment was not unreasonable. But the execution was not. A withdrawal of this magnitude, on this scale, in a sector where French forces held adjacent positions, required coordination with the French commander whose dispositions would be affected. That coordination did not happen. Koltz learned of the Gafsa abandonment not through formal notification, but through the observation that the units on his flank were no longer there. His personal letter to General Juin, written immediately afterward and preserved in the French military archive at Vincennes, describes the event with the controlled language of a professional who has decided that formal complaint is more useful than emotional expression. He notes that he was not informed, that his flanks were exposed without warning, and that his men were placed in a position that the original dispositions had not anticipated, and that the available forces could not adequately address. He does not use the word betrayal. He doesn't need to. The French casualties at Kasserine, approximately 500 killed and wounded and 250 missing, from a corps already at reduced strength, represent proportionally the worst losses of any Allied contingent in the battle. French unit records from this period document multiple instances of American and British units withdrawing through French positions without prior notification, leaving French flanks open to German envelopment. These instances appear in the French regimental and divisional war diaries with the same flat precision that characterizes all such documents, noted as tactical facts without the editorial outrage that they might have warranted. The French professional military tradition in 1943 was one of formal dignity in the face of circumstances that formal dignity was asked to endure at considerable cost. General Juin's post-battle memorandum to the French government in Algiers documented the ammunition and equipment failures with specificity, named the requests that had been forwarded and not fulfilled, and drew the connection between the material deficiencies and the casualties explicitly. The memorandum was diplomatically suppressed to preserve Allied unity. It did not surface in the scholarly literature until the French military archives began systematic declassification in the 1990s. When I was working through the French liaison reports from late January and early February of 1943, the reports that had been forwarded to Second Corps headquarters warning about the tactical vulnerability of the American positions around Sidi Bou Zid, I found myself thinking about the specific institutional irony of what those documents represent. French officers, operating with First World War equipment and inadequate supplies, took the time to survey American defensive positions, identify the mutual support problem with the three hill dispositions, write a formal assessment of the vulnerability, and submit it through proper channels. The assessment was accurate. It was filed. It was not acted upon. 2 weeks later, the positions it described as indefensible were overrun in approximately 90 minutes. The French liaison officer who wrote that assessment, his name doesn't appear in the English language record because the English language record doesn't make much space for French liaison officers, was right about everything. Being right about everything and being heard are different institutional achievements. The post-battle blame allocation for the French performance at Kasserine has the particular quality of coalition military politics. Each English-speaking party assigned the French responsibility for whatever failures could be attributed to units in their sector. while the French documents assigned responsibility to the supply failures and coordination breakdowns that had preceded the battle. Friedendahl's after-action report characterizes the French as having failed to hold assigned positions, a characterization that is technically accurate in the narrow sense that French positions were overrun, and profoundly misleading in the broader sense that those positions were overrun partly because they couldn't be held with the weapons available. Anderson's report is more careful, but still implicitly supportive of the Allied command decisions that had left the French exposed. Neither document acknowledges the 47-day supply request that went unanswered. Neither acknowledges the GAFSA withdrawal coordination failure. The French documents acknowledge both, in detail, with specific dates and reference numbers. The historiography of Kasserine has been built primarily on the English-language documents. This is not a neutral choice. The broader pattern that the French experience at Kasserine illustrates. A smaller coalition partner formally integrated, but materially disadvantaged, bearing disproportionate risk for decisions made without its meaningful input, and then partially blamed for the consequences of those decisions, is one that recurs with depressing consistency in the history of coalition warfare. The specific mechanisms change with each conflict and each partnership. The fundamental dynamic, in which the partner with less institutional voice pays the cost of decisions it didn't control, is more consistent than the specific details would suggest. General Koltz, writing to Juin in the careful language of a man who has decided that formal record is his most available instrument, was doing the only thing available to him, documenting what happened as precisely as he could, in the hope that the documentation would outlast the circumstances. The documentation is in Vincennes. The English-language historiography has not, for the most part, used it. The Free French forces in Tunisia fought for the next 2 years, through the Italian campaign, through southern France, through the Rhine crossing and into Germany, with steadily improving equipment and steadily increasing operational autonomy as the Allied command relationship matured and the French contribution was recognized with something closer to the respect it had always deserved. General Juin became one of the most respected operational commanders in the Allied forces in Italy, a judgment that was widespread among Allied generals and unambiguous in the operational records. The army that had been given First World War artillery and told to hold a 100-kilometer front in February of 1943 became by 1945 a force that had fought its way from the Atlas Mountains to the Danube. Colonel Bonfatti's 5th Bersaglieri Regiment, the Italian formation whose assault cracked the Kasserine Pass on the 20th of February, has no monument in the English-speaking world. General Koltz's formal request for 60 anti-tank guns, submitted the 1st of February and unanswered until it was irrelevant, is in the archive at Vincennes, stamped and dated and precisely worded, the most specific available evidence of what coalition warfare costs its most vulnerable partners when the paperwork moves faster than the guns. Chapter 16. The Reform Machine. The 12th of March, 1943, Washington, D.C., Army Ground Forces Headquarters. General Leslie J. McNair was at his desk, and he was writing, not an operational order, not a deployment directive, not one of the administrative documents that consumed most of a senior general's working day. He was writing what amounted to an institutional confession, a personal memorandum to General Marshall that began in language that is almost jarring in its directness, given the conventions of military correspondence. I have now reviewed the available reports. We sent these men into battle with inadequate combined arms training against an enemy who had been conducting combined arms operations for 4 years. The surprise is not that we lost. The surprise is that we held it all. 2 weeks after the pass was retaken, 3 weeks after the worst of the fighting, and the man responsible for training the United States Army is writing to his superior officer that the training was insufficient. Not that the enemy was too strong, not that the terrain was unfavorable, not that fortune had intervened. The training was insufficient. He put it in writing. He sent it. McNair is one of those figures in American military history whose influence was enormous and whose recognition has been almost inversely proportional to that influence.
He built the training architecture of the United States Army from 1940 through 1944. The standards, the exercises,
The evaluation systems, the combined arms integration requirements that turned 17 million civilians into soldiers capable of defeating the most experienced military force in the world. He did this largely without credit, from a headquarters that most Americans had never heard of, through a process of institutional work that is almost impossible to make into a narrative because it consists of memoranda, training circulars, inspection visits, and revisions to field manuals rather than battles and commands. His post-Kasserine response was characteristically specific. He convened working groups, reviewed the after-action reports from Tunisia, cross-referenced them against the training records of the units involved, and produced a series of revised standards that addressed the actual failures rather than their comfortable explanations. Between April and December of 1943, Army ground forces processed approximately 27 revised training directives generated specifically by the post-Kasserine analysis. These weren't motivational documents or vague directives to improve performance. They were specific, technical, procedurally detailed revisions to the way American soldiers were trained for combat. The Tank Infantry Coordination Directive specified that tanks and infantry must rehearse their coordination before each major operation, using terrain similar to the objective. The Artillery Forward Observer Directive specified communication procedures, observation post positioning requirements, and fire registration protocols that directly address the broken observer communications at Sidi Bouzid. The Anti-Tank Defense Directive specified the employment of tank destroyer units in forward-attached rather than centralized configurations, addressing the doctrinal failure that had left infantry formations without organic anti-armor capability throughout the Kasserine operation. The Command Post Positioning Directive specified that Corps and Divisional headquarters should be located within 2 hours vehicle travel of the forward units, a standard that Friedendahl's bunker had violated by a factor of 3. 27 directives, each one a specific answer to a specific failure, each one applying to every division still in training across the continental United States. The scope of this institutional response is something that I don't think the popular histories of Kasserine adequately convey, partly because reform happens in offices rather than on battlefields, and is therefore difficult to dramatize, and partly because acknowledging the completeness of the reform requires acknowledging the completeness of the preceding failure. Approximately 68 divisions were at various stages of stateside training when the post-Kasserine directives began arriving in April of 1943. Every one of those divisions, the formations that would fight in Sicily, in Italy, in France, in the Pacific, trained under standards that had been specifically revised because of what happened at Kasserine. The soldiers who crossed the Normandy beaches in June of 1944 had never heard of Harold Jennings or the 19th Engineers or the bunker in the gorge near Tebessa. But the training they had received, the tank infantry coordination drills, the artillery communication procedures, the anti-tank positioning doctrine, had been written in the specific shape of those failures. That is how institutional learning travels when it works. Not through the awareness of the individuals who eventually benefit from it, but through the silent revision of the systems they train within. The command replacement program that ran parallel to the training reform deserves equal attention. Between March and June of 1943, approximately 40% of the regimental and battalion commanders in 2nd Corps were replaced. Some of this replacement was straightforward accountability. Officers who had demonstrably failed at specific moments in the Kasserine fighting, whose failures were documented in Harmon's report and in the subsequent divisional after-action reviews. Some of it was the harder institutional work of identifying commanders who had not technically failed, but who had been revealed by the Kasserine experience as unsuited for the specific demands of corps-level armored warfare against a first-class opponent. Officers who might function adequately in a secondary role, but shouldn't be holding the tactical command positions that determined whether soldiers lived or died. A smaller number were rehabilitated, officers who had failed in one role and were reassigned to positions where their knowledge was useful without their weaknesses being fatal.
The system was imperfect, as all human systems are. It was more honest than most. The specific case that troubles me most in the post-Kasserine Command Review is Orlando Ward, Commanding General of the 1st Armored Division, the officer who had formally objected to the dispersal of his combat commands before the battle, whose professional judgment had been correct, and whose division had been destroyed partly because his objection was overruled. Ward's post-Kasserine trajectory was to be sent home, not dishonorably, not with a formal finding against him, but removed from command of the division he had built and trained, and sent to a training role in the United States. He eventually commanded the 20th Armored Division in Europe in the final weeks of the war. The official record does not contain a public acknowledgement that Ward had been right and his superiors wrong. The Army's institutional preference for managing accountability through reassignment rather than public assessment meant that the officer whose professional judgment should have been vindicated by the post-battle analysis was quietly relocated, while the man who overruled him was publicly celebrated upon his return home. Carlo D'Este's analysis of this episode in his biography of Eisenhower is pointed and correct. The reform was genuine and the accountability was incomplete, and these two facts existed simultaneously without the institutional machinery making them consistent. The German intelligence community noticed the reform before most American historians wrote about it. A Fremde Heere West assessment from November of 1943, held in the German Federal Military Archives, analyzed captured American training manuals from mid-1943 and concluded that American tactical doctrine had advanced significantly since the early North African period, and that the training methodology had apparently been substantially revised. This is enemy intelligence, written with no stake in the American institutional narrative, noting the specific change in the American training system. The assessment was accurate. The revision the German analyst detected had been driven by a 12-page memorandum McNair wrote in a Washington office in March of 1943, and by the 27 training directives that followed it. The Germans saw the product. They couldn't see the process. The process was McNair, working through the failures with the specific patience of a man who understood that the only honest response to a catastrophe is to name exactly what went wrong. McNair was killed on the 25th of July, 1944, near Saint-Lô in Normandy during the opening phase of Operation Cobra. He was observing the carpet bombing from a forward position when American bombs, dropped short of their intended targets in one of the most catastrophic friendly fire incidents of the war, killed him in a foxhole. He was a 3-star general, 61 years old, in a foxhole in Normandy, watching troops he had trained. The units advancing past him that day, the infantry moving through the smoking craters of the Saint-Lô carpet bombing, moving with the specific combined arms coordination that had been revised and refined and re-drilled since the spring of 1943, were the direct product of the work McNair had done after Kasserine. He didn't know the full measure of what his March memorandum had built. He didn't live to see the Rhine crossing or the German surrender. He was in a foxhole in Normandy, doing what Friedendahl never did, and the bombs fell short. The operational test of the reformed Second Corps came on the 23rd of March, 1943, at El Guitar, roughly a month after the worst of the Kasserine fighting, with the same formation reconstituted, but now containing the 7,000 replacements, the revised leadership, the amended procedures, the corrected coordination protocols. The German 10th Panzer Division launched an armored counterattack against the American positions that morning, with approximately 50 tanks, a force that, a month earlier, would have driven the Second Corps rearward in disorder. The 1st Infantry Division and its supporting artillery and tank destroyer units absorbed the attack in a prepared defensive position, destroyed approximately 30 German tanks, and held their ground. The exchange ratio that day was approximately the inverse of Sidi bu Zid, roughly 1 American casualty for every 3 to 4 German ones, rather than 10 American for every 1 German. Same corps, same theater. Different commanders at the battalion level. Different coordination procedures at every level. Different artillery communications. Different anti-tank positioning. Different outcome. Chapter 17. What we kept. The 26th of February 1943, 2 days after the last German unit withdrew from Kasserine Pass. An American patrol was moving through the pass from west to east into the morning light through terrain that 6 days of intense combat had converted from tactical battlefield to archaeological site. The evidence was everywhere: burned tank hulls, their paint blistered to ash, sitting at angles that showed where they had stopped and why. Discarded ammunition cases, German minefields fresh enough that the patrol moved carefully, reading the ground for the disturbance marks around each buried plate. Abandoned equipment, American and German both, the accumulated debris of an army that had come through this place in one direction and an army that had briefly come back. The road surface was damaged where tracked vehicles had used it as a turning circle. The scrub vegetation on the pass shoulders was crushed and torn where men had moved through it in a hurry. A patrol soldier, per the unit log of the formation that conducted the movement, noted a single German boot lying at the roadside with no obvious explanation for its presence. He didn't record whether it was occupied. The patrol continued east. The North Africa American Cemetery at Carthage, Tunisia, sits on a ridge overlooking the Gulf of Tunis, 14 kilometers from the center of the modern city. It was established by the American Battle Monuments Commission after the war and dedicated in 1960. It contains 2,841 graves, arranged in the formal geometry that American military cemeteries share regardless of their location. The white marble markers in measured rows, the central memorial with the carved names of the missing, the careful maintenance that makes these places look simultaneously permanent and temporary, as if the tidiness is an argument against time that time will eventually win. A significant number of the markers read, "Here rests in honored glory a comrade in arms known but to God." These are the men whose names could not be recovered from the records of February and March of 1943. The men buried in the chaos of retreat. The men whose temporary burial markers didn't survive the subsequent combat. The men whose dog tags were lost or misread or never recovered. The Wall of the Missing lists the names of 367 Americans whose remains were never found. They are named on a wall in Tunisia because they could not be named on a marker. The 3 officers present at Kasserine, whose subsequent careers most directly trace the line from the battle to the Allied victory, deserve more than a footnote in this accounting. Brigadier General Stafford Irwin, who positioned 48 howitzers in darkness at Thala on the night of the 21st of February and saved the Allied position in Tunisia through the application of professional artillery expertise under extreme time pressure, went on to command the 5th Infantry Division through the Siegfried Line campaign in 1944 and 1945. His divisional operations in the Saar region showed exactly the same methodical, artillery-led ground possession approach that had characterized his work at Thala. Careful, unglamorous, and consistently effective. General Terry Allen, commanding the 1st Infantry Division at Jebel El Hamra, subsequently commanded the 104th Infantry Division through Germany and into the final operations of the European campaign, leading a division that reflected his specific leadership philosophy. Junior leaders empowered, forward positions understood personally, men treated as adults who could be told what was required and trusted to deliver it. And Omar Bradley, Patton's deputy at 2nd Corps, the careful observer who had watched everything and said little, who had written in his diary that George is playing a part, went on to command the 1st Army at Normandy and ultimately the 12th Army Group, the largest American field army in history, containing at its peak more than 1,300,000 soldiers. His operational style, methodical, casualty-conscious, attentive to logistics, suspicious of theatrical gestures, was the direct product of what he had observed in Tunisia. The field manuals that carry Kasserine's lessons forward are not in themselves dramatic objects. They are government-printed documents, staple-bound, with standardized cover typography and the dense paragraph numbering of military bureaucratic prose. The 1944 edition of FM 17-33, the Armored Infantry Battalion, contains a paragraph on tank infantry coordination that specifies: infantry must advance in close coordination with tanks, neither lagging behind nor rushing ahead,
and must rehearse their coordination before each major operation using terrain similar to the objective. This language was not in the 1942 edition. It was written by staff officers who had read the after-action reports from Sidi, who had reviewed the Combat Command A accounts of the 15th of February and understood specifically what had broken and why. The paragraph is dry. It is procedural. It is the distilled institutional knowledge of approximately 1,600 men overrun on 3 Tunisian hills, translated into the bureaucratic language of a training directive applied to every armored infantry battalion that trained in the continental United States between April of 1943 and the end of the war. This is how institutions remember, not in monuments, in procedures. The 34th Infantry Division, the Iowa and Minnesota National Guard unit that bore the worst of the Kasserine losses, whose 168th Infantry Regiment was destroyed at Sidi, went on to compile one of the longest and most distinguished combat records of any American division in the Second World War. By the time the war in Italy ended in May of 1945, the 34th had accumulated more total days in continuous combat than any other American division in any theater of the war. They fought through Tunisia, Sicily, Italy, up the length of the peninsula from Salerno to the Po Valley, through Monte Cassino, through the Gothic Line, through every defensible ridge that the Italian terrain offered a retreating German army. The men who survived Kasserine fought for another 27 months. The connection between the catastrophe that introduced them to war and the endurance that defined their subsequent service is not coincidental. Institutions learn. Soldiers learn faster. The ones who went through Kasserine and came out the other side understood German tactics with the specific, practical clarity that can only be acquired by being on the receiving end of them. The survivors' accounts held in the Veterans History Project at the Library of Congress, oral histories recorded primarily in the 1990s and 2000s, when the veterans were in their 70s and 80s, describe Kasserine with a consistency that the official records partially obscure. Almost none of the veterans who discuss the battle describe it primarily as a defeat. They describe it as a lesson. Not a comfortable one. Not a lesson they would have chosen. But a lesson in the specific, serious sense of an experience that changed what they knew and how they knew it. A veteran of the 16th Infantry, recorded in 1998, described the 2 days at Jebel El Hamra as the place where we figured out what we were doing. He wasn't describing a strategic revelation. He was describing the specific tactical knowledge, how to use a reverse slope, how to pre-register artillery, how to hold a position against armor when you have the right anti-tank weapons in the right positions. That had been absent at Sidi Bouzid a week earlier and present at Jebel El Hamra. The lesson cost approximately 10,000 casualties across the Allied force. It was retained. What Kasserine produced, beyond the casualties, beyond the reformed doctrine, beyond the replaced commanders and the revised field manuals, was a specific kind of institutional honesty that the American Army managed to sustain, imperfectly and incompletely, through the rest of the war. The willingness to file an after-action report that said the training was insufficient. The willingness to write a memorandum that said we sent these men in before they were ready. The willingness to replace 40% of the tactical leadership rather than protect them with the institutional language of performed acceptably under difficult circumstances. None of this happened perfectly. Ward was sent home without public acknowledgement. Friedendahl was given a parade. The French after-action documents were suppressed. The intelligence failure was never fully publicly examined. But inside the institutional machinery, in the working groups at Army Ground Forces, in the training directive revisions, in the personnel assessments that reached the formations preparing for Sicily and then for Normandy, a specific, honest accounting of what had failed and why was being conducted and acted upon at a speed that had no precedent in American military history. When I started working on this project, the question I kept asking the archive was a simple one. What is Kasserine actually about? The straightforward answer is that it's about the first major engagement between American and German ground forces in the Second World War, and about how that engagement went badly, and then less badly, and then, over the subsequent 16 months, produced an American army that was among the most effective military forces of the 20th century. That answer is true. But the longer I spent with the documents, the casualty forms, and the maintenance logs, and the engineer work orders, and the French liaison reports, and Rommel's diary, and the marginal pencil notes on carbon copies, the more I thought that the deeper answer is about what an institution does when it fails. Does it protect itself? Does it blame the easiest available targets? Does it reframe the failure as something else, something more comfortable, something that doesn't require the hard work of honest accounting? Or does it write a memorandum that begins, "The surprise is not that we lost, the surprise is that we held it all," and then do the work that sentence requires? The American army at Kasserine failed in ways that were genuine, costly, and in several respects preventable. The command failure was real. The training shortfall was real. The intelligence failure was real. The logistical collapse was real. The coalition management failure was real. The dead in the North Africa American Cemetery at Carthage are the permanent, unambiguous record of these failures. 2,841 of them, in the white marble rows on the ridge above the Gulf of Tunis. They can't be argued away by operational metrics or reframed by a different historiographical framework. They are there because things went wrong, and the things that went wrong were in most cases knowable in advance and fixable in practice. And they weren't fixed, and the men died. And yet, the army that came out of Kasserine was genuinely different from the army that went in. Not immediately. The transformation took months, not days, and it was driven by institutional work in Washington offices as much as by battlefield experience in Tunisia. But by the summer of 1943, German intelligence analysts were noting that the American tactical doctrine had advanced significantly. By the spring of 1944, the formations crossing the Normandy were training under standards that the Kasserine after-action reports had directly shaped. By the winter of 1944 and 45, the American Army was conducting armored offensive operations in Western Europe at a scale and effectiveness that would have been unrecognizable to the men at Sidi Bou Zid. The distance from that flat Tunisian plain on the 14th of February, 1943, to the Rhine crossing on the 7th of March, 1945, exactly 2 years and 21 days, is the distance that an army travels when it chooses to be honest about failure. The pass at Kasserine is quiet now. The road through it, Route 13, the same road that Rommel's armor used, the same road that Gorforce leapfrogged back along, losing its 11 tanks, carries ordinary traffic, trucks, buses, the ordinary movement of a Tunisian provincial town that has grown considerably since 1943. The terrain is unchanged. Jebel Samama is still 1,807 meters. Jebel Chambi is still 1,544. The rocky ground of the pass floor still offers, to anyone who walks it with attention, the reverse slopes and covered approaches that the 19th Engineers found by instinct on the morning of the 19th of February. A visitor who knew the history could stand at the western exit of the pass and identify roughly where Gorforce made its last stand before falling back toward Thala. The ground holds the shape of what happened here. The graves at Carthage hold the names of the men who held the ground. The field manuals hold the lessons. And somewhere in a working group at Army Futures Command, in an office in Austin, Texas, a staff officer is reviewing the Kasserine after-action reports, alongside the lessons from the most recent training exercise, asking the same question McNair asked in March of 1943. What specifically went wrong, and what specifically needs to change? The question never closes. That is both the burden and the point.